Hi, everyone. A quick note before we start the show regarding the discussion about the unique horror of the American colonists' violence toward indigenous peoples is mentioned in this episode. We failed to mention another instance of this type of history, which should have been brought up. The Herero and Namaqua genocide was an awful event in history which, like the atrocities brought up in Mason and Dixon and our discussion, should not be forgotten or dismissed. Thank you and enjoy the show. Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Cody. I'm one of the co-hosts.
I'm Will.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Kate.
We are following the reading schedule from the Pynchon subreddit, and today we are discussing chapters 31 through 35 of Mason and Dixon. Will, can you summarize those chapters for us, please?
Absolutely. So Mason and Dixon awake one day in that Pennsylvanian metropolis to such startling quiet that they can hear the twitterings of birds for the first time in recent memory. They ascertain that something obnoxious must be afoot, probably another tent revivalist passing through, and bicker over whose clothes make them more suited to scoping out the sitch. Mason's conspicuously muted ensemble versus Dixon's ribald affair. After enough dressing down, Mason decides it'd be best to accompany his partner. Soon they meet with a brawl in the street and are spied out as out-of-towners by a relatively friendly man who invites them to a coffee house to receive the news. A militia, the Paxton boys, have slaughtered what seems to have been the entire population of women, children, and elders of a native tribe who'd sought refuge in the nearby town of Lancaster. They'd heard of the previous massacre in Conestoga, but it hadn't registered, and now the Paxtons were en route to Philadelphia to murder a sect of Protestant converts who resided therein. The pair cannot fathom this degree of cruelty. Cherrycoke sums it up. The liberty to hunt or maim another as much as one wished was still cherished as a core component in those days. It turns out the priest holds a certain degree of contempt for the practice of genocide. In the coffee shop, a vigil held for the arrival of the militia, monologues are made by nameless men. How much like the Irish or Scots are these Indians? Shouldn't they take up the Anglo tradition of shunning thy neighbors? Or is that simply a useful framework for the British purposes in the colonies? The discourse fades into an excerpt from talks, describing how the mysterious Franklin held the Paxton boys at the city's limit. They do not arrive this night, however. The clouds do. And the boys are back in the cafes, discussing their next steps. Dixon wishes he could have occasion to take up some arms against the militia, while Mason's hesitant. Regardless, they reminisce on the Jacobite rebellions of their youths, even though Dixon was barely sentient for them. Mason reveals his Luddist sympathies, shares how his old generation seemed riled against the earliest risings of industry. He feels he's been in exile from it his whole adulthood, though pushed more toward than away from anything in particular, unwittingly in pursuit of something. This conversation terminates in a brief fight, which Pitt and Pliny happily extend to a full-blown bout, complete with onlookers placing bets on the outcome. It is now decided that they've been up late enough, off to bed for the boys, despite their protests that the story promised hadn't been delivered. So Cherrycoke gives them the brief. No, they don't fight any Paxton boys. No, they don't they don't witness Pontiac's rebellion. Far too busy running lines and looking upwards for that. Back in 1763, Dixon tells Mason how his teacher entrusted him with a watch sworn not to need winding. Despite the clear lack of a key slaughter winding crown, the astronomer laughs him off. This perpetual motion is disturbing to Dixon, who soon questions whether Emerson has somehow devised a curse with this miracle of engineering. The watch itself, seems to tell him. It belongs with him. It belongs inside of him. He cannot bear it any longer, which is convenient. A tinker surveyor in their party soon becomes enamored, haunted by desire for this ticking enigma. He sneaks into Dixon's bags one night, seeking to hold the thing, but when he's discovered, down the hatch it goes. Not only does this surveyor lose his job on the team for the theft, but he very nearly loses his wife to the incessant ticking. Years later, tired of it himself, Desiring the fame of owning such a marvel rather than acting as a safe for it, he gags himself to vomit it up. But the little clock seems to bite his finger for the insult, so there it stays. When Dixon fesses up to Emerson about the fate of the watch, he receives a response from his wife. Reading the letter, the older man had found such humor in the events that he had a bad fall, but she passes along that all went according to his design. They spend a few days at a gaming house, partying with the proprietors of Maryland and Delaware, where the novel mixtures of substances all present consume seem to stir up unbefore-seen degrees of spirit. From there they move along west to the farm of the Harlands, in whose opinions of the interlopers are split. Mr. Harland is happy to host them, pocket the rent money, even volunteers them the garden. Mrs. Harland is less happy about all this. As their time there passes, Mr. Harland begins to join them in making observations, showing himself to be a quick learner in astronomy. And so they move on further west. We are treated to a montage as they map out the final initial coordinates for their soon-to-be Visto. Mr. Harland joins them for the salary, as well as the adventure, and when he returns, his wife has filled the yard with his least favorite crop. But he's changed, and so finds beauty in the plot. We flash back to the time Wicks explained the untangling of the Maryland-Delaware borderlines to Tenebrae. In short, the nobleman who'd laid out that geometry had flexible interpretations of how intersections might occur. A year later, they've laid it all out flat and neat. Sure, there's no lovely meridian straight tangent line, but at least Philadelphia isn't inside of Delaware, inside of Maryland. They return to the Harland estate for winter, a year's worth of hard work well done. Taking a vacation from labor, but not from horror, they attend Lancaster, where the massacre had taken place the prior year. They find it sickening how a whole tourist industry has arisen to take advantage of the recent event. Thankfully, they're saved from the tour by suspicious locals interrogating them about their providence. Dixon plays with fire, challenging all their excuses for the mass murder, but does not quite instigate anything but anxiety for his partner, and some general moaning about the differences between city and country folk. Mason, unable to sleep at the inn, wanders about in the early morning, and finds the sight of the slaughter to hold its dread psychic energy about the place. Dixon goes to see it himself, dressed in Mason's clothes, and acts as our eyes, horrified. They leave swiftly when he returns. Next is a break in the narrative. As Chericote gets tied up in an argument about the duties of a historian, he is of the opinion that certainty cannot be had about the past, and Ethelmer seems to agree, which disturbs the other men of the house. Ives is offended at the mention of this newest form of popular art, the novel, while Euphemia defends many of those plots as very much possible, thank you very much. Tangential to brandy which is poured, Wicks tells a story of how he once rode a coach full of people. One of these travelers was a young mother going to Philadelphia to engage a lawyer to defend her from a land robber. Her husband had nearly died in a hops bin disaster and swore to have seen God. Now he's off preaching, leaving her to defend the property. She'd paid off the Pennsylvanian taxes, but her Maryland neighbor filed a claim on it, saying that since it was clearly in Maryland itself, she'd been delinquent, and it was now in his sheet. They approach the city. They step out, speak to the driver, and find him absent, as the coach dissolves, leaving them stranded on the prairie. There, they drink Octorara peach brandy until somebody saves them.
All right, thank you for that. So let's start off with everyone's general thoughts and feelings on these chapters.
I personally had probably the hardest time reading these chapters of any of them so far, which I found strange. I think there's a lot of really good content in here, especially in the early chapters as they're going about through the surveying, and then eventually through the whole thing with the watch, and then when they visit the site of the massacre. I thought all of that stuff was really great, but it kind of, at least to me anyway, goes into very strange territory, especially in the last two chapters, that I had some difficulties parsing out, and had to go back and read through a few of the paragraphs, a few of the pages a couple times. But, there's a huge span of time that's also in these 5 chapters. I believe that the first few of them, as they're going through surveying work, is about a year's worth of time of them actually drawing out these lines. But it did feel nice for them to finally sort of get to the work that we've been expecting them to arrive at up until this point. And there's some very interesting sort of musings on capitalism and land acquisition, especially in that section where they're dealing directly with a farmer and his wife. The scene in particular where they finally draw the line that cuts through his property, and then suddenly he describes like this change in the man that he suddenly wants more property, like he wants more land, he wants to expand out what is his is very interesting. This idea that demarcation and boundary line and cutting these lines through the land is actually, shifting the attitudes and the desires of the people that it's affecting. I think the way that he describes that and puts it forth is really fascinating. And frankly, all of the conversation about the American Indian Wars and the massacres that took place, I think similar to kind of what we were talking about last week with, Washington owning slaves and some of the darker aspects of American history, is really important because it's a period of American history that in schools here in America does get talked about, but not nearly in the same depth. And so in the same way that someone going through those chapters that we went through last week maybe doesn't understand how a lot of what they're reading is pulled from actual history, I think there's a similar education to be had here as well, in that, the orchestrated killing of natives in this country wasn't just done by the military, it wasn't just done by the government. In a lot of cases, it was done by people who had nothing but just genuine hatred for a different people group. And there was a lot of the same interesting ideas about colonialism cutting both ways that we found when they were in Helena and Cape Town. That's just as, the same here. This is the scene where Dixon and Mason are talking about, well, we had this reasoning for why people were being pushed to extreme lengths in these other nations, whether it be the weather or the particular location of, this island or the wind, but why is it happening here? What is uniquely American, or what is uniquely present in this country that's causing it, and how it's afflicting people who have no reason to be afflicted, because by all accounts they should be, living in harmony with the people who are here. It's a lot of very tough discussion, but I would say vital, and it really does turn the lens on the reader to wonder not only why this is history they're not aware of, but also why it happened in the first place. So there's a lot in these chapters, definitely, that's worthy of discussion, as I'm sure we'll get into. But I also found that as they were closing out, I was having a bit of a hard time understanding what Pynchon was going for.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from with that. It definitely, I think for me, there were several parts of these chapters that I had to kind of go back and reread a couple of times to kind of not necessarily remind myself of what had happened, but to just make sure I was staying on track with the way things were going. But at the same time, everything you touched on just now, Kate, was like, I don't want to say my favorite part because it makes it sound kind of strange.
Mm-hmm.
It's I think one of the most important thematic parts of this story is that idea of what drives the evil that men do. Is it nature? Is it built into us, or is it a result of our circumstances and the position that people get put into that drives them to do these horrible things? And not only that, but in that kind of revisionism of history that you mentioned with the way American schools operate, of not either blatantly not talking about a lot of these things, or glossing over it in such a way that it's almost made to look trivial and blown out of proportion. And that's where I think we tend to have a lot of problems, where people have forgotten the awful things that have been done in not just this country, but really throughout history by people. Mm-hmm. And that allows those kind of things to recur, the old adage of history repeating itself. But it ultimately comes down to who has the power and authority to write that history, and that allows it to be directed in that way. That being said, there were a lot of, I thought, really funny moments throughout here.
Yeah, sure.
There were some beautiful passages that we'll get to in time, but I really did enjoy these chapters. I think I would argue that I enjoyed them more than the previous 5. But there was definitely, I think, a lot more going on, both thematically and plot wise.
To kind of build off some stuff that Kate talked about, it was interesting to me that the Americans, like the American urge to subdivide land and build fences and be really into real estate and land ownership is linked to the creation story in Genesis, which I think kind of is a really kind of, the more I think about it, I mean, it's a really nice move by Pynchon slash Cherry Coke, in that it does kind of link this book and that kind of stuff to Manifest Destiny, and the feeling that like the whole like America being a city shining on a hill or whatever that whole thing is, which I was taught in school, but I'm kind of blanking on some of the specifics. But I did find that aspect of these chapters really interesting. I also had something else I wanted to say. One sec. Oh, one thing that struck me while I was reading these chapters, especially the part about the Paxton boys and them massacring presumably innocent and I think at least somewhat assimilated Native Americans, is that I don't like, whenever you think of I don't know, like, you know, a lot of specifics about the British colonization of places like Africa and India, but I'm not aware of there being, like, you know, wholesale genocide and massacres and slaughter of the natives like there was here in America. You know, like, I don't think that England went into India and, you know, like, I'm not under the impression that, you know, I think I've seen figures that, you know, over 100 million Native Americans died as in the 1700s and 1800s and perhaps even earlier. And I just don't, I could be wrong, and perhaps one of our listeners will correct me, or Brett will correct me, but I'm just not aware of those types of, like, insane genocide numbers happening in places like Africa and India. You know, like, you don't hear about, and I'm of course not an expert, but you don't hear about British soldiers or, you know, British civilians in India just killing native Indians, people from South Asia, killing Indians just for no reason. You know, like, and like what happens in these chapters. I have spent some time in Africa, and I'm not aware of any instances where I'm aware of instances where there was battles and wars between native Africans and white settlers, but not just white settlers just killing natives just for the fun of it, basically, or just because they exist. So I did find Pynchon kind of highlighting those two things very interesting in these 5 chapters. On the enjoyability front, I probably like these chapters better than the first 5 in the America section. The last, like, I think chapters 28 and 29 and 30, I think, in the last section kind of confused me a little bit, and I found these a little bit more clear-headed. And then one final thing is, one of my favorite parts about the America section is that there's all these stories within the story, and the focus can kind of go off Mason and Dixon for significant chunks of the text. And you know, the story about the guy eating the watch, and then I think in chapter 35 there's a lot of stuff about Cherry Coke and being on like a traveling or something. Like, I do kind of enjoy the stories within the stories that are kind of asides that happen in this section.
Yeah. And I will real quickly just kind of piggyback on what you mentioned, Luke, about the uniqueness of the American colonization. I'm with you in that I don't at least recall there being any majorly documented genocides of any kind in other parts of colonial Europe. Now, that's not to say there weren't atrocities committed and terrible things done in the name of colonialism. Colonialism in itself is an awful thing. But I think it is a uniquely American situation, that level of violence against almost literally everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and I think to kind of build off of that, and I am curious about your first point, Luke, about comparing the building of America to the creation story. I feel like that would be good to go into more detail for the listeners. But no, I agree. I can't say that I've experienced any education about the same thing. And I feel like the difference is a lot of those colonial projects, especially in India, were being executed at the behest of the British government. Like, the British government itself was sending troops and businesses and companies in there to do what they were doing, whereas it seems that the distance between the American colonies and England seems to cause a different end result. That's at least the kind of guess or what I've picked up in between reading the history that I have read, in that it was just so far away, so hard to control, and with the rapid expansion of private business and private equity in America, it led to people just kind of doing what they wanted. It's not necessarily contemporary to this time period, but I think the Osage murders is the perfect example of that, where you have this group of Native Americans that ended up with land that was situated over a vast reservoir of oil. They became very wealthy, and then robber barons came in, murdered all of the Osage people, took the land, and took it for their own, private business expansion and inquiries there. I don't feel like that same mentality of capitalism or private equity or whatever term you'd want to apply to it seems to have taken root on a broader perspective in some of the other colonial projects. Obviously, a lot of Indians died, but I believe it was a lot more institutionalized than it was necessarily from a business perspective or a private ownership perspective like it was in America.
So my understanding is that, this kind of thing is pretty never before seen prior to the American experiment. But after this initial wave, and then the early 19th century U.S. government's more organized attempts at genocide, there were such projects as the Belgian Free State. The Boer Wars are framed as wars in South Africa, and they are Dutch colonists being genocided, but in a sense it's similar to what's happening in the U.S. in the 1700s, and in a little bit prior to then there were the Zulu Wars in British South Africa. But this, I think, a key part of this book that Pynchon is trying to drive home, especially in these chapters, is that America, even if it wasn't the first place that things like this happened, because of course the Romans genocided the Celts, that this is the first time. This is a breaking point, it seems, at least Pynchon wants to say, that this is where suddenly the world learned that you could treat other people like this. Mm-hmm. And it seems like he's ascribing it to maybe not necessarily something intrinsic to the land or to the people, but something about the land and the people and the substances and the economic incentives seem to have formulated what we now term genocide.
Yeah, it did occur to me the Belgian Congo thing after I finished talking. You're right. A point I wanted to make real quick. I don't think it comes up directly in Gravity's Rainbow, but I do think it's probably part of Pynchon's kind of background for Gravity's Rainbow that you should be aware of, is that the American genociding of Native Americans served as kind of an inspiration for the Nazi genociding of Jewish people and other undesirables, which is something I think I know that people in Germany know that. I was at a bachelor party years ago and I was very drunk, and there was a German guy there, and I stupidly, because Germans hate when you bring up Nazism, but I stupidly brought that whole thing up, and he started talking about how, well, America did it first, basically. Which is an interesting point, and one that, you're definitely, like, it's not like you're taught in American schools that even that Americans killed a huge number of Native Americans, let alone that America doing that served as kind of a lead into and maybe kind of an excuse for the rise of Nazism in Germany.
Yeah, and just to highlight the difference between growing up in a red versus blue state. I was taught in middle school that suicide didn't exist before Americans started killing natives.
Mm.
So yeah, there's some variation there. But no, it's I love these sections despite the fact that they are truly disturbingly just they're full of horrors.
Yeah.
They really are.
Yeah.
Like the section where Dixon is looking around at where the rifle butts hit the walls rather than somebody's skull,
Mm-hmm.
or that there's still blood in the seams between bricks. It's just it is so powerful, and it's right in the middle of these ridiculous scenes where this guy's telling you about how well they twist up the tobacco leaf real well and it makes a Mobius strip.
Yeah.
It's a cool thing that this section pulls off, because it doesn't feel quite so heavy in hindsight. I don't think, at least, but it is.
So yeah, in reading these chapters and specifically in thinking about the horrors that are mentioned throughout, I took some time kind of after reading. I don't remember which chapter it was. I think it was 33 or 34. I kind of took a little bit of time away from it just to kind of process things and really think on things. And I was also kind of doing research on like the Paxton boys and some other little of the history behind all of this kind of stuff. But I was thinking about what we've been talking about, this whole idea of, what is it that Pynchon's trying to, narrow down, but what's he trying to get out, regarding all of these things? And you all have touched on it so well, about the history and cycle of violence that has occurred. What it made me think of is there's a quote from Frank Herbert, who wrote Dune, one of my favorite books and series. And because those books deal so much with government and how quickly corruptible it can become and easily corruptible it is. And it was in Chapter House Dune that he said, all governments suffer a recurring problem. Power attracts pathological personalities. It is not that power corrupts, but that it is magnetic to the corruptible. Such people have a tendency to become drunk on violence, a condition to which they are quickly addicted. And I was thinking about that quote in relation to this part of this book, and how I think part of, if we're trying to figure out what caused all of this, I think it was Will mentioned, or Luke, one of y'all mentioned that, there was a huge distance between Europe and America. And so that ability to kind of keep things in check was almost gone. It was kind of like the parents had left for a week and the kids were in control, and it turned into a Lord of the Flies situation real quick.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, you have this new settlement that is, number one, we're grasping for power in this new area, but we also now have guns, which weren't really a thing in the early parts of European colonization. So now it's even easier to kill a bunch of people real fast, real easy. So I think a sort of combination of those things allowed for this to start. And once it started, it was just unstoppable. And we've seen it continue, obviously, throughout American history. But that was the first thing that kind of came to my mind, was that corruptibility and that ease in which it happens and who it happens to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even Pynchon himself gets into that idea of distance, because when Mason and Dixon first land on the shores of America, I believe it's Dixon is the one who immediately recognizes, oh no, these people aren't British. This is an entirely different thing. Like, and part of that they bring up, I believe, if I remember correctly, from those chapters, is how far away it is. It might actually be when they're on their way there that Dixon sort of corrects Mason in saying, like, you're expecting them to be British because technically it is England, it's a colony, but that's not what it's going to be. And yeah, and I think the cycles of violence and the cycles of history is something we've talked about a lot on this show, because it's so important to the book and what Pynchon is examining. But even something like the Paxton Boys has its cycles in very short order after this period of history is done. I mean, you can look at like the bushwhackers or the pro-Confederate partisan guerrillas during the Civil War that engaged in, you know, guerrilla warfare against both the Union Army, but also specifically targeting escaped slaves or regiments of black soldiers for like complete destruction. You know, to the point where Quantrill's Raiders was the inspiration for Mannix's Marauders in the Hateful Eight. So there is even a portion of history that is pretty contemporary to what's happening, but just sort of out of sight, that is directly drawn to the mapping of the Mason and Dixon line. You know, without the Mason and Dixon line, you don't have the boundary line set for the Confederacy that defines where these guerrillas were coming from and engaging in what they were doing. And then even then, you move further forward into history and you have lynching and Jim Crow and all of that. So the target, so to speak, hasn't always remained the same, but it is something that does seem to be a uniquely American problem that we have a very, very difficult job in this country getting rid of. And it seems like there is something inherent to the building of the country in the first place that is affecting that. And I think a lot of that is really what Pynchon is trying to push towards in these sections. And it's interesting to see him develop them, because in theory, this section of 5 chapters could be fairly pedestrian, you know, just following Mason Dixon and the Axemen drawing the line. But instead, he's using it as a tour through effectively cultural disaster to really spotlight how these things have existed for a very long time in worse ways than most people know. I mean, the quote on page, I think it's 347 in most people's editions, where Dixon goes to visit the massacre site, and he specifically says, I don't pray enough, Dixon subvocalizes, and I can't get upon my knees just now because too many are watching. Yet could I kneel, and would I pray, 'twould be to ask respectfully that this be made right, that the murderers meet appropriate fates, that I be spared the awkwardness of seeking them out myself, and slaying as many as I can before they overwhelm me. Much better if that be handled some other way by someone a bit more credible. He feels no better for this outpouring. And that was one of those sections in this chapter, this set of chapters, that really hit me hard, because that feels very similar to what a lot of people say during modern atrocities, where it's just, I can pray, I don't think that's going to do anything, and I want something to be done about it, but at the end of the day, I can't do anything about it. It's very modern language is the note that I specifically wrote down in something that is a near ancient problem with the period of time that it's talking about.
Yeah, and I would also, I'm glad you brought up that quote, because I wanted to also mention there was a quote right before there on page 346, where Mason is talking to Dixon. He says, "Acts have consequences, Dixon. They must. These louts believe all's right now, that they are free to get on with their lives, that to them are no doubt important, with no glimmer at all of the debt they have taken on. That is what I smelled, Lathwater. One of the things the newly born forget is how terrible its taste and smell. In time, these people are able to forget everything. Be willing but to wait a little, and ye may gull them again and again, however you wish, even unto their own dissolution. In America, as I apprehend, time is the true river that runs round hell." So yeah, it's just that awful cycle that we're just stuck on.
God, time is the river that runs around hell in America is such a profound quote still.
Yeah.
I would love to hear Luke expand on that thing he brought up earlier.
I was just about to ask the same thing, yeah.
The Manifest Destiny thing?
Yeah, your point about the founding of America versus the creation story.
Yeah, I did find that really interesting. I was actually a history minor in college. I think in like the pilot episode of this show, I said I was a history major, but I was actually an English major and a history minor. But I did have a professor who I took a few different classes on the 1800s who talked a lot about the westward expansion in the late 1800s and linked that with Manifest Destiny and all of that. It does seem to have been a thing in America. I think even going back to the Mayflower and Jamestown and stuff like that, like America as a sort of promised land, America as like a God-given opportunity to his truly faithful, like to his Jews, like, you know, his the elect in the Calvinism definition of the term, which I don't. That's not necessarily a thing that we think about anymore as much. You know, we've conquered the American continent. There's not a lot of there's no land left for us to conquer and stuff. And I do think I've talked about it in past episodes about Pynchon's kind of obsession with real estate and subdividing the land. I do think it's interesting that it's a real part of like a very like foundational aspect of the American project is that everything that the American government does, everything that Americans do is kind of preordained, and that this land was always here, just kind of waiting for us to conquer it. And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of in early America, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of awareness that the people that were living here, while they may not have had European style civilization, were not like early Americans seem to tend to view Native Americans as not even the noble savage, but just the savage.
Yeah.
Which I think that kind of plays into the Paxton Boys stuff and different stuff I was talking about earlier, where people don't seem to, and this is true for African Americans at this time, and I guess Native in America at this time, probably. I'm not 100% on the exact population numbers. For that thought, but I do think it's interesting that, you know, like the whole everything I was talking about, just basically Manifest Destiny, and if you don't know what that is, it's pretty easy to Google. That does seem to kind of come into play even with there's some other parts of this chapter about British expansion and how American colonists were mad at the British government because they weren't allowed to expand into the Ohio territories, which they had just fought a war with the French and some of the Native American tribes over. And I don't know, I guess to summarize everything, it's just Americans seem to view Western expansion as their God-given right, I guess.
Yeah, there's a weird
fair
sense of pride that's attached to it that I've never been comfortable with.
Yeah. Well, and I like that you brought up the Calvinism, like predestination elect argument, because one of the things that came to mind as I was reading the section where they talked about sort of the decision on behalf of the Paxton Boys and the citizenry to quote unquote finish the job was that they went and killed natives that had converted to Christianity. And that to a certain degree, you have this group of people deciding who the elect actually are. You have this rogue element who likely, as we talked about many times, had a religious affiliation because most people did at this point. It was just sort of normal, choosing to put on other people, no, you're not actually of the elect. You're not actually of the people of Jesus. We are making that decision for you, and we are going to sort of cast you out of Eden, so to speak, within this idea and framework of westward expansion and of viewing America as sort of a analog to a creation myth. I don't know if that subtext comes across too strongly on the page, but it was something that definitely hit me as I was reading those sections.
Yeah, well, and I did a little bit of research on the Paxton Boys, which was depressing as all hell.
Yeah.
And basically, and I would love to get some insight on this from Brett whenever he gets a chance to. But basically, they were squatters on tribal lands, which was in violation of treaties that were around at the time. And they basically could not wrap their heads around the fact that these indigenous tribes could be friendly, and declared all of them to be a threat. And anyone else who was associated with them or they felt threatened by were also considered a threat. And so that's essentially who they targeted. So they went into Conestoga town on December 14th, 1763, looking for a specific tribe member. His name was Tinsadagua, and I probably horribly pronounced that. He wasn't even there, so they went ahead and just killed as many people as they could there, and then went back to look for him again on December 27th of 1763, which is where that's what's mentioned on page 304. And again killed, I think it was 20 of the Susquehannock tribe between both of those attacks, including women and children. And yeah, as you mentioned, like basically drew the ire of everybody that was there, and Ben Franklin even wrote in his narrative of the late massacres that the Susquehannock would have been safe, quote, among any other people on earth, no matter how primitive, except the Christian white savages of Paxton and Donegal. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, these guys were a rogue element who took it upon themselves to act out this sort of vengeance or vigilante justice that they had built up in their mind, which is scary that happened almost 300 years ago and is still relevant today. We still see that kind of shit now. And again, history doesn't, no one learns from history, and we end up going through it again. So,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've dated somebody who was Native and learned a lot about Native history outside of just the kind of American Indian War period, to the point where one of the things that she told me at one point was that I think it's like 54% of the U.S. population thinks that there are no Native Americans left, that they're just completely extinct, which is a statistic that is insane to hear, but is completely backed up by actual research and surveying. Like, as far as, to Benjamin Franklin's quote, like, these are people that should have been safe amongst any other people on Earth. They had land treaties, they had these early things that we, to a very minute degree, tried to hold to, but these rogue elements, these squatters on their own land and all of that, just completely exacerbated and kicked off this cycle of violence that has led to a world where a good chunk of people believe that there are no Native Americans left. Like, that is a depressing.
I can't wrap my head around that.
And when she told me, I couldn't believe it. It was absolutely crazy to hear that, and then to know that it was fact. Yeah, blew my mind for months afterwards.
One thing that just occurred to me, that I was talking to my brother a few weeks ago, just kind of randomly. We were talking about, I don't exactly remember the context of this conversation. We were talking about the sale of the island of Manhattan in the, I think, early 1600s. And he was talking about how, I don't think this is true for every Native American tribe, but whatever tribe that was, I'm blanking on which one, according to my brother at least, didn't have any concept of land ownership. I don't think that's true of every Native American tribe, like I said, but it is interesting that, like, we look back on that as such a, like, it comes up on Reddit every once in a while that, like, today I learned and everything, but it is, like, that real estate is worth so much now, and then it was sold for just some beads and some whiskey or something. And it is interesting to think about the fact that, the Native Americans didn't even realize what they were selling. They just thought they thought they were basically getting free money, because they had no concept of people taking over something like something like land and excluding others and charging people to live on it and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, I mean, and that gets to another quote that I found incredibly striking. When they're going through, I forgot the name of the, like, farm owner that they talk to, but when they finally finish cutting up his land, there is this excellent quote here. It's on page 334 in my edition. It says, here's Harland among the sunflowers having romantic thoughts for the first time. Betts notices it. He has changed. He has been out running lines into the distance when once Brandywine was far enough, and now he wants the West. The meaning of home is therefore changed for them as well, as if their own fields had begun with tremendous smooth indifference to move in a swell of possibility. And there's a section just before that quote where Harlan the farmer kind of has a indifferent perspective towards working his land. Like he just kind of says, oh, whatever, like, you know, you, my wife, you know how to handle it. Why don't you do it? I'm going to go, like, essentially watch Mason and Dixon do their thing. But by the end of it, the only thing that they've done is essentially mark out a line. And in so doing, he immediately has a romanticized view of what is his and what can be his, because there's anything like a demarcation point. And that final clause in the sentence, this swell of possibility, is inherently a little terrifying if you're looking at it as the reality that even the non-native settlers kind of had this view that just land was there and you could live on it, you could grow stuff on it, but there wasn't an idea that it was something that you could own or that something could be yours and something else wasn't, until something made that incredibly obvious to you. And it definitely stood out as one of the most profound quotes in those early chapters of this section.
The most poignant aspect of the Harlands to me is the fact that he goes out with them, he checks out the telescope, and he follows them not because, I mean, sure, there's the 5 pounds salary, but it's not about that for him. He's clearly enthralled with the idea of astronomy, the idea of learning more about the world. And it's really, it's really poignant that, the way that it capitulates for him is to find this sudden ache for expansion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and going back to that concept, because I think it's a widely held belief that the indigenous peoples here didn't understand what they were getting into and didn't value land ownership and all that. I don't think. I think that's been pretty thoroughly debunked as far as, or at least it's been shown to be a gross exaggeration. I think what it really is they didn't know capitalism, and they were operating on a completely different, economic system than what was introduced when the settlers came over. And so, yeah, all of a sudden you have, all these Daniel Plain views that come rolling in, taking everything that they want and not caring who they're hurting or who's, anything that they're taking away. It's meaningless because it's theirs now. But I also wanted to touch on what Will brought up was that interest that Harland had in astronomy. Because I loved that dialogue between Mason and Dixon and Harland and the kind of explanation of the process of astronomy. And I was out of town over the weekend for 4th of July with some family, and I ended up having a discussion with someone about how insanely accurate those methods still are, but especially how accurate they were at the time. And I was doing a little bit of research today about the measuring, because it brought to mind, I think his name was Eratosthenes. I'm probably horribly mispronouncing that one. He mapped out an idea of the circumference of the Earth based on the shadow that was cast from one part of Egypt, I think is where it was, to another, and he was insanely accurate with that. But I also found there was a Greek astronomer named Poseidonus who was able to also extremely accurately calculate the circumference of the Earth to, I think, within a couple of 100 miles, which is insane when you think about the actual circumference of the Earth. And he did it using the star Canopus. And that specific instance, his Poseidonus's measurement of the circumference of the Earth was actually mentioned by Pliny the Elder, which I thought was a neat little connection back to this book. But yeah, it was astronomy in this time period, and even way before, is, I think, once you understand the fundamentals of it and how it works, like there's a lot more that goes into it than is mentioned in the book.
But it's absolutely fascinating how extremely accurate it can be, but also, and this comes up on page 334, how once you get off track or get off course or make a mistake, how quickly that grows exponentially. The quote I liked about that was that it says, "'Twas like tickling a fly under its wing pit with a long and wobbly object such as a fishing pole." I thought that just kind of highlighted the difficulties of doing these measurements accurately but how accurate they could be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so going back to the Dune quote you brought up earlier, I just realized in many ways you can look at all of this as an extended metaphor for knowledge is power, in the sense that astronomy is literally just looking up and measuring like the arcs of certain stars at certain times of the year. And from that you can devise all of this concrete information about the Earth in front of you.
Yeah.
And it really is, that later in the book we'll get into the way that in Eastern cultures and Asian cultures, astronomy was held as like a kingly affair. But in this case, we really see that this one guy looking up at the stars and this one guy going out on a bit of an adventure really does show him, hey, I could own all of this. This is a power I have. I can look at the world and I can control it because I know it.
Yeah. Well, because I know it and you don't. So I can take advantage of that.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I also wanted to touch on, since we're still kind of in the early part of these chapters, I did also want to touch on the opening of chapter 31. I really loved the dialogue between Mason and Dixon that opens that chapter. Let me go back to it in my book just to pull some examples, but it's basically just them kind of like nitpicking each other a little bit and kind of prodding each other a little bit about, how they're dressed or, their basic being. And I thought it was just such a great example of the character dynamic that's developed between these two and how much they, how friendly they are with each other. They have these kind of back and forth with each other.
Yeah, their dialogues throughout this entire section are really very heartwarming to me.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I mean, you have them fighting, but it is friendly fighting. It is the kind of fighting that brothers have.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And later on, you even see, Mason calls him an astronomer. Mason calls Dixon an astronomer.
Yeah.
My God.
I do think there's kind of an element of flirting in the opening section. Not like literal, like romantic flirting, but just kind of, poking back and forth. And, if they were romantically involved, which they obviously were not, we would call it flirting. And it's kind of like repartee, I guess, in a lot of ways.
Definitely.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I agree with Will wholeheartedly. Is the dialogues between them in these sections is so funny and very endearing. I wish I could remember what page the quote was on, but there's one point where they jab at each other about how they finally quote unquote trust one another, or like, oh, it might actually be worth it to keep you around now. But only just so much. Like, it's, as we've talked about a couple of different times, like it rings so true to life of either people that you work with and get really close to, or just people that you're really close friends with. It remains a real centering point for the novel, and is a really intelligent choice on Pynchon's part to keep that so central to it, because you really do care about these guys as they go through things, and it's really heartwarming to see their relationship grow as you get deeper and deeper into their journey.
Yeah, and so that brings me to what I wanted to talk about next, was the opening of chapter 32, where you have the kids kind of specifically are prodding Wicks to put more action into the story and more thrills and stuff. And I think that was a really interesting section there, because I think it kind of shows that I think what Wicks is getting at is that you don't need to have all of that to tell a good story all the time. Yes, it's good to have it. You have that dramatic element, you have that tension that you build, but you can have a story like this that is primarily focused on this relationship between your characters. And it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. You have these platonic, brotherly, familial relationships between characters that are so powerful, but I think tend to get lost in that search for constant action and excitement. Yeah, and Lord of the Rings is another good example of that. I think that, you know, a lot of people tend to focus on the action and the wild things that go on, but they tend to miss what I think is the kind of central part of that whole story is the formation of these relationships between those characters, specifically with Lord of the Rings between Sam and Frodo, and with Mason and Dixon between the titular characters. I think that for all the action that takes place in this, the boat attacks and the pirates and the science pirates and all the other, you know, intense moments, for me it's the story of these two men and their love for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think I'm going to try not to spoil anything, although I don't think it's a major plot point later in the book. But the fact that there isn't any violence in that, you know, even as Kate brought up earlier, you know, Dixon, in response to the massacre of the Native Americans, pray. The prayer is pretty ineffectual. But a piece of literary criticism that I don't have up on my phone anymore because I already read all of it. But it kind of focuses on the piece of literary criticism that I think is just available free on Google. If you just Google Mason and Dixon literary criticism, it's maybe a page or two down. But the literary critic was talking about how Dixon, over the course of this book, gets increasingly frustrated and annoyed. I think frustrated is a better word than annoyed with the treatment of minorities and everything. And it does kind of climax around, I think, page 700 with some actual violence on Dixon's part, which again, I don't want to spoil anything. But I think y'all perhaps remember what I'm talking about. It involves a slave trader and everything.
Yeah.
But I do think it's interesting and to kind of build off what you were saying, Cody, because it would be, you know, more immediately gratifying in a kind of base way if Mason and Dixon, you know, got in a fist fight, but it does make some of the payoff later in the book that much more meaningful.
Yeah, and I just started to wonder how much of this is in some way, given how much Wick's Cherry Coke can be read as a Pynchon self-insert, even though he is not one-to-one. How much of this is him responding to people who were mad at Vineland being the follow-up to Gravity's Rainbow?
That's a good question.
A good point. Yeah.
Yeah, especially with the way you framed it, Cody. Thank you for putting it in the way of, you know, relationship story versus action story. I hadn't thought about it until you said it that way. That, you know, Vineland it's full of action, but really it's almost all relationships. And Gravity's Rainbow is famous for its insane comic book action scenes.
Yeah.
So yeah, you got to wonder how much of that's going on here, or how little.
Well, not just that, but it's also interesting, as we've been talking about this, I've also realized that while their relationship is the center point, it is really almost used to walk through these periods of history to showcase the reader the atrocities that have been committed time and time again, and the effects of colonial projects and expansion westward and all of that. But even in talking about those, Pynchon does not directly put the violence on the page at any point, which, if we're thinking about it as a response to, you know, the frankly comic book like action of Gravity's Rainbow, or the you know, sort of action that takes place in a book like Vineland, it really requires the reader to think about things ancillary to what is on the page to fully understand the action that he is diving into. And he's doing that through the lens of a intense sort of one-on-one friendship or relational perspective. in a way that I find very compelling. That didn't really actually occur to me until we started talking about it in this way. In that, yeah, these massacres happen, and yes, they visit the actual, leftovers of what had happened and the sites where they took place, but the connection to what is actually going on is consistently off page, and the further implications of what is going on are in the history books outside of this novel. It's a very interesting idea and a very interesting way to go about telling this particular story, especially when compared to the things that he published beforehand.
Let's move through the plot a little further into chapter 32. I wanted to get y'all's thoughts on Emerson's watch. I thought this was a really interesting part of the story because it reminded me of the Maxwell's Demon section of Lot 49.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, I want to get into the ultimate fate of the watch as well, but I just kind of wanted to talk about the concept of the watch itself as a sort of perpetual motion machine is essentially what it's made to be. But I also wanted to get y'all's opinions on who do we think that Emerson, is it explicitly stated that Emerson built it, or that he is just the owner of it and is having it watched after?
I was under the impression that it was just a gift from Emerson. I could be wrong.
Same.
Right, that's what I thought too. And so I was curious who actually built it, because I don't think that ever came up.
No, it's kept vague. Yeah, it's he's kind of implied with the what he says in the letter back to Dixon after everything's gone down. It's kind of implied that he might have designed it, but not really. I mean, he talks about it. It just says, "Felicitations, fool, for it hath worked to perfection."
Okay, yeah. So what I thought was interesting, I didn't make this connection until I got to chapter 35 and was going through the wiki with it as well. But the debt repayment that Edgewise mentions has a similar, kind of operates on a similar concept, and I've been thinking about that now as it relates to the conversation we've been having, because Edgewise talks about, when he's talking to Cherrycoke, he says, "Why, damn, Rev, just write me another note. What's it matter with the color of the paper? Who has any cash anyway?" Business then in this province, wagering included, was conducted overwhelmingly by way of credit. The flow of cash was not as important as character, duty, a complex structure of debt in which favors, forgiveness, ignominy were much more likely than any repayment in specie. So I've that's been on my brain since we started having our conversation about power, and it's kind of come to me that that's another form of power that is exercised over people to keep them in check and keep them complacent and keep them in your pocket, is that system of credit that exists now. And so it's interesting because it does kind of operate on that fundamental kind of strangeness that the watch does, where there's nothing really there. It's all working on the idea that it's working. It is really what's driving it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I just thought that kind of just came to me in thinking about our previous discussion. So, but then ultimately, as we know, the watch ends up in the stomach of RC, and I want to get to that name in a little bit as well. But I loved that scene. I thought it was really funny. It reminded me of the gold watch scene from Pulp Fiction.
Yeah.
So I was kind of playing that in my mind as I was reading it, but there's a whole, I had all these little notes that I set aside in my book while I was reading that. So there's that connection to Pulp Fiction, which, considering that movie came out in '94, I don't know when Pynchon came up with that specific concept, but I just thought that was an interesting little connection there. But the other kind of pop culture connection that I was curious on is the watch speaks to Dixon in his dreams and takes the form of a vegetable. And in his discussion with Professor Vohm about it later, I was constantly thinking, was Pynchon listening to, there's a Frank Zappa song on the first Mothers of Invention album called Colony Vegetable.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if that had some sort of influence, because there's a line at the very end of that song that says, "Call and they'll come to you, covered with dew. Vegetables dream of responding to you, standing there shiny and proud by your side, holding your hand while the neighbors decide why is a vegetable something to hide." Just the weird specificity of it taking the form of a vegetable, I thought was so specifically chosen. And I know, given what we know of Pynchon, I would have to imagine he's a Zappa fan. So
Yeah.
just kind of curious if there's a connection there.
I'm glad I wasn't the only one who noticed that, because I had actually just purchased absolutely free on vinyl. There's a used copy that came to a local store of mine that I
Nice.
listened to. Yeah, like a couple of weeks before getting to this section, and that was immediately what came into my mind too. And I have no doubt that that Pynchon would have been a fan of Zappa, especially probably that period of Zappa. In particular. So I'm glad I wasn't the only one who clocked that.
I'm glad I wasn't either.
So I actually have an entirely different pop culture reference with regard to that exact exchange.
Oh, cool.
Okay.
So it connected to me to the original version of The Thing, called The Thing from Another World, in 1951.
Okay.
Sure.
Pre-John Carpenter version.
Not the Carpenter version. Yeah.
The original story?
The original one.
Yeah. Where the Thing is a giant carrot, essentially, that has evolved into the ability to take the form of other beings.
See, I haven't. I'm only familiar with Carpenter's. I know that it's a story that existed before the movie, but now I'm going to have to go look into this. This is
the original story is called Who Goes There.
I don't think this is actually part of Who Goes There. I've skimmed Who Goes There, and I haven't seen The Thing from Another World, but I know a lot about it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the in the John Carpenter thing, Blair's character in The Thing from Another World essentially goes on in the scene where, in the 1982 version, he's looking at the computer graphics. He's talking about how, this thing is essentially a vegetable that has grown the ability to eat other things. And it just seemed incredibly resonant there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it very well could be that too. We kind of know he has an affinity for horror films. So, damn, I hadn't thought about that. I'm gonna have to go look into that. Thank you for bringing that up. That's awesome.
Yeah. The other thing that the watch conversation brought to mind for me is that RC is, as the Pynchon wiki mentions, it sounds like just kind of at RC.
Arse, yeah.
But it also, it means remote control in our modern day parlance. And I think I don't know what specifically you're supposed to get out of it, but it seems very resonant, the idea that remote control ingests time and can't remove time from itself.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That somehow either time is remote control, or that which is remote control does use time in an unreversible fashion.
See, I hadn't thought about that, and that was going to be my follow-up question: is if y'all had any theories on the RC, the name itself? Because as you mentioned, well, the wiki only has that mention of Ars, and so I couldn't really think of anything. But that's the remote control idea. I like that.
Yeah, well, especially given what we had already discussed with the usage of LED in the first chapters, and then given the fact that, in a way, this surveyor does end up having his life controlled by the thing that he ingests. Like, he can't sleep for a while. It kind of ruins his marriage. Like, it being inside of him really does begin to take control of a lot of aspects of his life. That does resonate, that potential explanation for it. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what he was doing.
Yeah, and then furthermore, there's the later in the next chapter, there's the discussion of how they're all at this gambling house having a good time, but all the people who'd spent a lot of time in Philadelphia are constantly checking the time on their watches. And besides that, in chapter 32, there's this paragraph, which I'm not going to read the whole thing, but by early youth, R.C. had become the kind of mean, ornery cuss his neighbors associated with years of maturity. 'Twas his profession did it to him. As a young surveyor, from the rude shocks attending his first boundary dispute, he understood that he must exercise his art among the most litigious people on earth. and that, you know, the way that capital is used as a euphemism for control and preterition, and all these things are tied together. It seems like that if you want to mine these like 4 or 5 pages about RC and the watch, I think you could get a lot of specific social critique out of it.
Well, there you go. I think that's a really great theory. I'm going to go back after we record and reread that section with that in mind.
Yeah.
That section did also contain one of my favorite kind of funny moments where just kind of at the end of the explanation, Emerson describes it as, for within it lies a secret mechanism that will revolutionize the world of horology. And Dixon's response is, it calculates when she's overcharging and by how much, something like that. And Emerson doesn't even he doesn't even clock the joke, pun intended there. But he just moves on from it, and just like what it does do, Plutonian, Emerson told him patiently, is never stop. I always love a good joke where the joke is told and no one cares, and it just leaves the teller of that joke standing there looking stupid. So that was, I just love that little moment.
That was a good one. I did also enjoy the moment in there where someone tries to reach inside of him to feel the watch or remove it, and it's like mutated or is
And bites him.
Yeah, is turning into something else. That definitely brought up the point that Luke made about some of the cyberpunk influences on this book that we talked about several episodes ago. Definitely.
Thinking about it with the thing in mind, it also kind of could tie into that now as well, now that I'm thinking about that. So the other thing I wanted to bring up in chapter 32 was the Delaware Triangle, the wedge. Really, the only thing I wanted to mention about that was I just thought it was interesting, given at the start of the America section, we had reference to the geometric scars that mark the Earth. And that's essentially how the Delaware Triangle or the wedge is described. It's indeed the oddness of demarcation here. The inscriptions made upon the body of the earth, primitive as designs pricked by an Iroquois, with a thorn and supply of soot upon his human body. I just thought that was an interesting little throwback to that idea that, by marking the earth in the way we are, what impact is it having, either physically or metaphysically in some cases.
Yeah, going back to kind of how Kate had mentioned these being difficult chapters, that section is incredibly difficult for me to really untangle, and it is really meaningful to me, and in a sense that I can't actually understand at all. But it is just evocative of a deep kind of geological dread, I suppose.
Yeah. That's a good way of describing it. And that's actually a kind of a situation I've found myself in when trying to describe parts of Pynchon's books to people who are not familiar with his work, where it's this phenomenon where I can understand how it impacts me, but I can't articulate how it impacts me.
Yeah.
And it's almost like frustrating and maddening, because I want to sell people on this writing and what it means to me, but I can't put the words together in a way that does it well enough, other than just saying, go read the book. But even then, I can't guarantee that they're going to have the same experience with it that I have.
Yeah, this entire section is in some way, and I think it has a lot to do with the watches, and I have not spent enough time on these sections to really get to the root of what my mind is working on here. But there's something about the talk of watches and time, and the way that throughout this section, time chronology of the chapters of the book just break down. You have it's a much more tangible aspect in the rest of his big novels, but in this particular section of Mason and Dixon, time does not give you anything. a year passes in the space of a couple of paragraphs, and then you have an entire chapter dedicated to like a 10-minute conversation, and you have all of these things happening out of order, with like Tenebrae having the boundary lines of Delaware explained to her at some weird point in time where no one else is in the parlor room. It's just her and Wix Cherry Coke chatting about maps for some reason.
Well, I think the other interesting thing is in this section, there's a brief aside where it mentions that the watch is trying to speak, but it can't either formulate the words or it can't make an audible sound, which reminded me of when the two clocks on the ship were talking to one another. There does seem to be something, to your point, Will, that Pynchon is working at, and that either time seems to function differently here, or that because of isolation or something like that, time is not able to be accurately kept, or the existence of this perfect perpetual watch in league with nothing else like it is alone counting time, and there's nothing to balance it off against, to the point made, I believe, by Dixon, where he says, like, if it's off, how would anybody know? And they don't have an answer for it. Yeah, it's an interesting thing that I tried to find somebody discussing it, and most of the time it's just brought up within context of, yeah, this section comprises about a year, and now we're going to move on. Like, there hasn't been much of a deep dive in that. But I agree in that it does seem as though Pynchon is reaching for something, but I'm not sure what it is.
So chapter 33, for me, a lot of that chapter just dealt with the detail related to measuring everything out and plotting out, how the lines work and all that. Let me go to that section real quick, because I had a couple of things I did want to bring up. Oh, there was a scene in the beginning part of it is on page 329. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's pretty long, but it's starting with, "At least I am about my business in the honest light of God's day." When they're at the what is the name, the Janviers, they're having the discussion with the quote unquote pious gentleman, and the discussion is happening while they're consuming these massive amounts of coffee, and it's the smoky environment. What it brought to my mind was Jim Jarmusch's Coffee and Cigarettes film. I don't know if any of y'all have seen that, but
I have.
Just that the idea of these intense discussions happening over coffee and cigarettes, or in this case cigars or whatever other tobacco products they happen to have. But it's always such a really interesting, I find it very cinematic, that idea of having a conversation in that particular kind of setting. Cigarette smoke always has that air of mystique to it, and there's a certain beauty to it, I think, as well, that especially on film really lends itself to certain types of conversation, and that particular scene just kind of put that into my mind. Also made me really want a cigarette, and I quit doing that a long time ago, so that was a bit of a struggle.
I quit doing that a while ago, funny enough, while watching Coffee and Cigarettes. I was like, I'm gonna watch this movie, and when it's over, I'm also done smoking. And I smoked through most of that film.
It's hard not to, I would imagine. I haven't watched it since I quit, but
absolutely.
One thing that came up in that article I was talking about, which I didn't find this necessarily super original or anything, but it did. The author of that article that goes into Dixon's frustrations over race relations also went into the role of pubs and coffee houses in terms of like political movements and stuff like that. And he kind of got into how like those, like whenever pubs and coffee houses started to open and come about, at least in England, I want to say he linked it to the 13th century, although it could be a little bit later. He did talk a lot about the importance of those kinds of institutions in terms of fostering the idea, even just the idea of free speech and being able to go someplace and speak your mind and not worry about the consequences for it. Which I do think I found it interesting to think about. It wasn't ever anything that I consciously had thought about. Going to a bar or going to a coffee house with your friends and being able to speak your mind without censoring yourself. I think a lot of times we take that kind of stuff for granted nowadays, especially in America, not necessarily in other countries, maybe as much. But I did find that interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I completely agree. I work for a coffee company, and a big part of our culture is trying to create that environment where people can like meet in a place that is not their home and connect over good conversation and things like that.
I used to have a lot of those kind of moments, of not necessarily specifically at coffee houses, but a lot of times I had friends of mine and I that would, very, very late at night, would be playing video games at 2 or 3 in the morning, and we'd find these kind of all night diners around and go there and just have these really, just like unfiltered and really interesting discussions over, sometimes just a cup of coffee and a pack of cigarettes. And it's one of those weird things where you don't really appreciate it so much at the time, but when you can look back on it, you really value that.
Yeah, that was a lot of how I spent my free time in college too, was a lot of going to the 24-hour diner and just sitting and talking with whoever came in the door. And it is interesting to see how that is a long-standing tradition.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's this bar in my town that it's the only bar that I go to, and it's kind of like Cheers times like 1,000, in that the only people who really go there are people who only go there. Like it's nearby the liberal arts university, so sometimes there's some trickle in of like students, but for the most part, because it's the last bar on like the main street in the town that I live in, it's mostly populated by the same people, and it is always noted for like the type of conversation that you can get in with other sort of regulars or semi-regulars there. And I've had some of the most profound discussions of my life there, definitely. And it's nice to have like a fixture, whether it's a late night diner or a coffee shop or a bar or whatever, where you have that space to freely just get into good conversation with people. It's super lacking in the 21st century, where we can all just kind of communicate with our phones or other means of connection. There's something not quite the same as a face-to-face chat, usually late at night, over some shared communal drink or cigarettes or something like that.
Or at the very least, like a day's work, so everyone's a little tired and fed up with things. No one really has the patience to censor themselves, even if they would rather. They're in their right mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really, the only unless anybody else has anything from chapter 33 that they wanted to bring up, the only other thing I had marked was the dialogue between Harland and Mason and Dixon that we already kind of talked about, with the accuracy of astronomical measurements. Did anybody else have anything for this chapter they wanted to touch on?
Well, I wanted to ask you, Cody and Luke, since you've read Against the Day, is Rose Quartz brought up in Against the Day in a significant moment?
I don't remember rose quartz. I remember the Icelandic spar.
Yeah,
obviously is the big one, but I don't recall rose quartz.
For some reason, something about one of those earlier sections of Against the Day, like one of the Miles scenes or something. I don't know what it is, but for some reason it's catching something.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I do think that there is some type of connection there, although I would expect the Pynchon Wiki to perhaps pick up on that if so.
That's what I'm checking right now.
Yeah, quartz definitely does come up in Against the Day. I just don't know if the adjective rose, like the color rose, is included in those mentions, is what I'm blanking on right now.
Yeah, in particular, it's that you might be transported beneath the sea under the northern ice section. It really reminds me of Against the Day there, and it might just be calcite is very similar to quartz, and a lot of stuff happens in the Arctic up there in that book. So I don't know.
Well, and also under the surface as well. So
Yeah.
it could just be a confluence of all of those. So in chapter 34, and I apologize because I'm going to take things back to a dark place again for a little bit here. I wanted to get y'all's thoughts on the, I guess the owners or the whoever would claim ownership of the silver star, the inverted star that's mentioned on the tavern sign that Mason and Dixon see. It's described as the weapon depicted black upon white is notable for the device upon its stock. A silver star of 5 points reversed with a 2 point up and 1 down, a sure sign of evil at work, universally recognized as the horns of the devil. It's something that was mentioned earlier in the book. I don't remember the specific page. The Pinchon Wiki mentions the specific page it was brought up on. But I don't think it's not clearly stated, at least up to this point, it's not clearly stated who's meant to be represented by that symbol. And it's not the KKK, because that's 100 years in the future that group organizes. So I'm not sure if y'all had any thoughts on, who the owners, quote unquote, of that would have been.
I mean, it could be a proto KKK thing, and there are anachronisms in this book.
That's true, because they are mentioned as white horsemen. I think it's page 101 was where it was earlier mentioned, and that's where they're referred to as the white horsemen. That's what got me thinking about the KKK, but then the time didn't match. But you're right, yeah, there's a lot of anachronisms in his work, so very well could be.
Yeah, I definitely felt very deliberately referential to the KKK.
I'm not sure it's supposed to be owned by anybody in particular. I think it's just supposed to be a sign. I mean, it's literally when they see what is upon the tavern sign.
Yeah,
it's a little lampshaded.
So chapter 34 also has, and we, again, to go back to the Paxton boys and the atrocities that they carried out, and not just them, but going back to our initial conversation at the beginning of the episode, just in general, the atrocities in America, especially against the indigenous people. There's a quote in here that I really loved when they're in this larger conversation with Jabez about what happened, and he's basically telling him, like, you guys came here, why are you bringing all this up? This is just the way things are. And Dixon says, these were said to be harmless, helpless people, Dixon points out, in some miraculous way that does not draw challenge or insult in return. Apprehensive among these folk, Mason, who would have perhaps used one adjective fewer, regards his Geordie partner with a strange gaze, bordering upon respect. They were blood relations of men who slew blood relations of ours, Jabez explains. Then if you know who did it, for the Lord's sake, why did you not go after them? This hurt them more, smiles a certain oily Leon, fingering his frizzen and flint. Aye, they go on living, but without dear old grandmom. Puts a big hole in the blanket, don't it? That is just some of the darkest dialogue, I think, in this book. And it's insanely impactful, because that is the mindset of the people who were doing these things. And to articulate it in that way, I think, was just profoundly haunting. And I mean, it worked. It gets Penchon's message across, and I think that is done so well. But that little exchange just took me back. I had to put the book down for a minute and just really stop, because that's such a horrific thing for a human being to say.
Yeah, I don't think I can add anything to that.
Well, it seems, in particular, this time period, based on Against the Day, blood feuds were a big deal in Pynchon's mind. As we know them today, the concept of these familial generational disputes where kin killing kin is viewed as equal to the wronger being killed by the wrongee. Mm-hmm. It seems to me like the most simple way to describe what a blood feud is hurts him more. Might as well just do what hurts him more.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's just so, I don't know. I can't imagine the process of coming up with that dialogue. And I mean, I'm not a writer, so it's not my job to do that. And he does it so effectively. It's just I think it's just such a juxtaposition because we're so used to talking about Pynchon's prose and his ability to kind of convey beautiful imagery a lot of times. And I think you could probably make that argument with a lot of authors, but it takes a really talented author as well to show the horror and things like that in an eloquent way that is done here.
And the thing about that section that makes it disgusting is, to me at least, it is how somebody would think about it. It's not some like scheming villain who's like, yes, we shall kill all of them. They just kind of want to get their revenge, and they want to hit them where it hurts.
Yeah.
And it's thanks Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil is really what makes it sting sometimes, like here.
So moving on from that, well, actually, I did have one other thing I wanted to bring up, and I think it was interesting. I think that we read this section at this time of the year, with 4th of July being yesterday as we're recording this, because when I was reading this particular chapter, with going through the mention of the atrocities committed by the Paxton boys and everything else that came up prior to it, in looking at that part of history today, or yesterday rather, and this time where we're supposed to celebrate our country and all the great things that it's done, it's interesting that we have this celebration, or this we're supposed to have this pride in the country that we come from, despite not having anything to do with how we got there necessarily. Like, we're I can speak for myself and say I was born here. I had no way of deciding where I was going to be from, but to have this overt sense of pride in spite of all the horrors that have been committed in the past in the name of making this country what it is, it's really hard to do that in knowing that history. You know what I mean? Like, it's there's certainly things to be proud of that we have done as a country. I think that goes without saying, but I think it's also important to look back and think about the not great things that we've done as well.
Well, and I think that's part of what Pynchon wants to do with this book.
Yeah,
yeah, absolutely. In that, he was a very socially and historically aware writer of a frankly shocking amount of the world's history and import. And I think he uses his writing very effectively to try and showcase those things, to hold a mirror to his audience and be like, I think you need to do some thinking about where you come from and the history of the place where you come from. And he does it in a way that feels very effortless and does not feel preachy, but is instead there to inspire or kind of spur on introspection and personal sort of responsibility to learn, which I really appreciate.
And so that kind of leads into chapter 35 and the opening part. I absolutely love this little opening section from Wix about how history is presented, and it's such a well-written passage about who records history and how we decide how it's presented in the future to the people that it is presented to. That's a terrible way of phrasing it, but it's, I don't know. It was a really, I went back and read it probably 2 or 3 times just to kind of really soak all of it in.
Yeah, I kind of read that passage as, in a sense, Pynchon declaring, I'm doing history here. It's not the thing that everybody treats history as, but that's what this is. This is what the work of history is. It's going back and it's dragging up things that you care about, things that you think are relevant, things that you think need to be remembered. And then, nowadays, as he says, her practitioners to survive must soon learn the arts of the quidnunc spy and taproom wit. And what was he but a spy and, to a large degree, a taproom wit?
Yep.
Yeah. And that whole... Man, I went back and read that particular paragraph that quote comes from, Will, I think probably 3 times, just because there is such a simple understanding of the reality of history and of truth and how it changes and gets moved around and forgotten, and that in order for it to survive and actually continue on, it needs to adapt these almost human qualities. And yeah, just the way he portrays that through that singular paragraph, and this last chapter sort of as a whole is, we talk about it all the time. It's one of these moments that just kind of stops you dead in your tracks and makes you appreciate what an incredibly talented author he is and how considered he is in what he's doing at all times, because it can feel like he throws a lot at you and that you're kind of stuck in the waves of it all, so to speak. But if you learn to let yourself just kind of surf on his words by paying close attention to them, it's so incredibly rewarding to experience.
Yeah. So I wanted to get y'all's thought on this, and this is just a quick aside, but the mention of Baron Munchausen got me thinking about Terry Gilliam's film. And that led me to thinking about Terry Gilliam potentially doing a Pynchon adaptation and which one he could do. I've this has been kind of rattling around in my brain for the last couple of days, and I'm not sure. I would have to throw back to early Gilliam. The newer movies of his I've seen haven't really had the same impact that his early, like Brazil and Time Bandits and Baron Munchausen had. But I think really the only one that I could think of him potentially doing would be Vineland.
Yeah, that was the first one that came to mind. I would also want to see his version of Inherent Vice. I think
that occurred to me as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I would not change a single thing about the version of Inherent Vice we got, but I would be very curious what Terry Gilliam's adaptation of that book would be like. But yeah, second to Inherent Vice was definitely Vineland in my mind as far as what he could adapt.
Have you all seen Gilliam's The Zero Theorem?
I have. I actually really like that film.
Gilliam's my favorite director in general. I've seen everything except for I think Tideland, which I've heard is really bad.
It's not great.
It doesn't feel like a Gilliam film.
Yeah, no. There are some similarities between Bleeding Edge and The Zero Theorem. It just now occurred to me.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
With the virtual reality and different stuff like that.
Yeah, he would be able to do some very interesting stuff with the virtual reality space and all the stuff with Gabriel Ice in particular, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do think there's a little bit of crossover, at least, between The Zero Theorem and Bleeding Edge. So,
yeah,
I hadn't thought about that. That's good.
Yeah, I'm not a big enough fan of his to have a strong opinion, but maybe his earlier self. I actually could see him doing Mason and Dixon. Younger Gilliam. I don't want to see him nowadays.
Yeah, his earlier stuff has a lot of. He did Jabberwocky, which is a period piece.
Jabberwocky's great. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I mean, he does have. He at least used to have. I guess the new one or the newest one, the one about Don Quixote, I guess is also somewhat a period. It's kind of a period piece in some ways.
Yeah,
it's on Peacock, I think. By the way, yeah.
Okay. I know that was the one he's been trying to make for forever and just never could.
It's entertaining, but the development hell of it definitely comes across in the final product. Yeah,
drags out so long. I mean, eventually you're going to lose that creative momentum that you had.
Adam Driver's great though.
Oh yeah, I forgot.
Is he? He's Don Quixote.
He isn't Don Quixote. He's Sancho Panza.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, that makes about as much sense.
Or like a weird bastardized version of Sancho Panza. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so getting back on track. So I had a question for y'all regarding at the top of page 350. There's the mention. It says Herodotus being the godfather of all, and his refusal to utter the name of a certain Egyptian deity. The Pynchon Wiki literally just has 3 question marks for that. And the first place my mind went to was the reference to Thoth in Lot 49. And I was reminded when I was looking into it to try to verify how on track I might have been with that. The Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum mentions that Thoth was credited with creating the art of writing, inventing the calendar, and controlling space and time. So it seems to be a somewhat logical fit, but I can't, I don't certainly have the ability to say with certainty that that's who he's referencing.
Yeah, and Thoth does, which I think I talked about during our Crying of Lot 49 episodes, but Thoth was important to the Jack Parsons, and I can't remember the other guy. I think will probably be able to come up with the name.
Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, I mean
Crowley,
he does. Yeah, Thoth I think does have a place in their theology or ideology or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, to put it incredibly briefly, Thoth is viewed as the same person as Hermes, who is viewed as the same person as Horus, who is viewed as the same person as Osiris in a very specific branch of esoteric religion. And he is Thoth and / Hermes is viewed as essentially like the image in which Jesus and Muhammad and all of the other prophets took inspiration from. And so, Herodotus not being willing to utter the name of truth. I think it's Thoth.
And then I had a couple other things that I wanted to bring up. The mention of the invisible snake trick. That was another one the Pynchon Wiki didn't really have anything on. I couldn't really come up with anything on that either. I don't know if any of y'all had any thoughts on that.
I did kind of look that up a little bit ago, and Deleuze, which is a proper noun in there, is linked with the flute, and then I did link that to playing a flute. I think it was like a flute-like thing where you would do snake charming.
Okay.
So I don't. Obviously, that I'm not exactly sure what that has to do with the snake being invisible necessarily. Another thought I had about that is that it does seem like there is some kind of a romantic undertone in this section, or it does seem like there's a little bit of the different family members are kind of vying for the attention of the female cousin. I want to say I think the Pynchon Wiki. I want to say, or maybe it's that listserv I keep referencing. We're talking a little bit about how Cherry Coke himself seems at least somewhat interested in the female cousin. I don't know.
Yeah, I interpreted it at first as basically what you just said, Luke, with the idea of it being like somebody doing a snake charming routine, but with no snake, as a weird get-up. But I could also see it with that the sensuousness in mind. Yeah, I could see it as being more of a kind of a sex performance of some kind too. That wouldn't surprise me, especially with the way Euphronia kind of generally talks about her past.
That was what I picked up off of there too, as well.
That makes sense, yeah.
It feels very, I'm going to talk about something that is taboo for the time period, so I need to come up with a different way to describe it.
Which also comes up earlier in the book with Mason at the hanging, and a few different parts I think have some double entendres.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can I just say that I really love the way that this chapter segues from a stupid argument, and I don't mean as in the conversation shouldn't be had, but I mean that Ives and the other uncle, whatever, are just kind of asshats throughout the entire conversation.
Yeah.
Well, like Ethelmer and Wix and even Euphemia and Tenebrae are trying to like actually think clearly about these kinds of things. But segues directly from that into like this long, maybe allegory about progress, situated as like a ride in an early Model T.
Mhm.
Except that the segue is literally just, oh my god, this is peach brandy from Octorara.
How
And
lucky we are.
you don't get anything about it until the very end, when it's just literally like, yeah, and then I just started drinking some brandy.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you mentioned Ives and God, I can't remember the other uncle for the life of me now. Just being complete asses. Because I loved. I was going to bring this up when we do our funny parts, but I'll just go ahead and bring it up now. Ives' attack on the novel, which I just thought was a really funny description of it, with his insistence of it being this horrible society destroying thing. But at the beginning of his rant, he sounds like Foghorn Leghorn, which I have to imagine was intentional.
That's, yep.
It's so I want to read the quote because this whole thing is just hilarious to me. It's so as if having just detected a threat to the moral safety of the company, Ives announces, quote, I cannot, I say, energetically enough insist upon the danger of reading these storybooks, in particular those known as novel. Let she who hears heed, Britain's bedlam, even as the French Salpêtrière, I probably horribly pronounce that, being populated by an alarming number of young persons, most of them female, seduced across the sill of madness by these irresponsible narratives that will not distinguish between fact and fancy. How are those frail minds to judge? Alas, every reader of novel must be reckoned a soul in peril, for she hath made a devil's bargain, squandering her most precious time for nothing in return but the meanest and shabbiest kinds of mental excitement. Romance, pernicious enough in its day, seems in comparison wholesome. I have to imagine that was just a ton of fun for Pynchon to write.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's so many great lines in that piece of dialogue. I don't see how it couldn't. Like, there's so many good ones to point out. Yes, obviously the beginning is a Foghorn Leghorn thing, but as someone who works mostly with people younger than herself, like, the phrase "an alarming number of young persons" is what I feel every day I walk into work, and every day I engage with the teenagers that work in the coffee shop that I work in. That
The youth.
yeah, this is an alarming number of young persons.
I'm
Well,
glad I
it's-
don't
it's
have
a-
to deal with that.
Well, you know, it's a lot of, you know, response to the same things that like Don Quixote was, going off our previous conversation. But also, it, you know, it is in some sense him saying, all right, me, if you're gonna say that you're writing these histories in the form of these fiction novels, you're gonna have to at least point out the fact that sometimes people are gonna take your lies for truths.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if you look up Operation Blackwing, which if you've read Gravity's Rainbow is a pretty important part. Well, there is apparently, I just found this out, apparently a Star Wars Old Extended Universe novel which talks about an operation which uses the same code name. Well, if you look into the blogs that talk about that Star Wars novel, they have taken Gravity's Rainbow for fact.
Interesting.
So yeah, I mean, just as an example, clearly he's aware that, you know, it's possible that the frail minds can't judge.
So what? Okay, I wanted to get y'all's opinion on there's a little interjection when Wix is telling a story where it says, "We believe you, Wix. We do. Pray go on." Do you take that as the family they're not believing Wix and they're just trying to like placate him and, oh yeah, we believe you, or is it more Wix doubting himself and they're trying to, like, you know, encourage him to keep telling the story?
It could be just the fact that maybe Pynchon thought that, or, you know, Wix himself thinks that maybe he's belaboring his point a little bit, and then he seems a little bit self-conscious, so they're just like, you don't have to belabor this point anymore. That's how I interpreted it.
Same here.
And the last thing I wanted to bring up as far as the plot itself, we get at the end of the chapter a pretty good example of Pynchon's feelings towards real estate. We kind of touched on this earlier in the episode, and to kind of foreshadow, we got an email from Brett. He touches on this as well, but in this story, and then also in Lot 49, and very much so in Inherent Vice, we get this a real sense of Pynchon's disdain for real estate investments and how all that plays out. The whole scene where the taking over of land is mentioned. It starts with Grote, one of the farmers whose land adjoins the Redsingers, has long coveted their farm and furthermore believes that both farms are located in Maryland. And it goes on to kind of talk about, like, detail out how this land was taken out from the landowner, and in a wider, you pull out in a wider scope of the land taken from the indigenous tribes that were here prior to European settlement. And it's it's obviously a big important part of this story and other of Pynchon's stories as well. And I think it's something that I think a lot of people nowadays don't really consider. I think we're the people who are involved in real estate are so caught up in making money and wheeling and dealing and are similar to as it's described in this, are not necessarily attentive to the impact that this kind of transaction has on people, both in a micro and a macro scale.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this particular topic always comes back to that line from Lot 49 for me, where the person says that even the dead persist in a bottle of wine, when talking about the dandelion wine made from the wildflowers that grew on the gravesite that was plowed over for a freeway that was never built.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that phrase, this idea of the endless expansion and selling of land and all of that Pynchon clearly hates, can't erase what came before and the human cost of it. And that's always what I go back to, is that very simple sentence that is quite damning from that book, because it can be it can be interpreted very literally as it is in that book, but it can also be certainly applied to moments like this, where we read about squatters eventually completely eradicating a tribe of Native Americans for their land and for that great expansion, which then later would get divided up into plots for housing and business.
Yeah, and that's not even to mention the ecological impact.
Yeah,
that it has. Did y'all have anything else you wanted to bring up as far as plot or anything, or should we move on to the humor?
Well, you have this note here at the end. The machine is being referred to at the end of the chapter. I took that, and it brought me back to the conversation that we had at like the very first episode or second episode, where we were talking about deism and this idea of God is just something that is just an entity or something that created this clock, this device that he turned on and then just disappeared. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that is sort of the takeaway that I had to it, that yes, time is definitely part of the machine that he's referring to there, but that the machine is almost this reality that was set up to run for everybody. And the fact that there's a specific mention of like a conductor on a track that you can't find, like there is something guiding it, but you can't see the conductor, you can't talk to him. It's a great quote, and perhaps we should just read it. But it really reminded me of the deistic viewpoint of creation and the actual religious idea there, especially coming from somebody who was a religious figure and then kind of faded out of that. It feels like a very deliberate reference to deism to me anyway.
Yeah, and beyond that, I see it a lot as a discussion of, the control forces that Pynchon is always discussing in his works.
Yeah.
That
Mhm.
he,
Yep.
as he goes to great lengths to describe, he doesn't think that there's some secret cabal controlling everything. He doesn't think that conspiracy theories or conspiratorial thinking is the right way to go. But he definitely seems to believe that if you're going to try and understand the world around you, that's the only way you're going to get anywhere close. But in reality,
Well, it's especially relevant to Mason Dixon's musing on why they were brought together, and
Yeah.
like whether or not it was something that needed to happen or was always going to happen or fate or whatever. And despite both of them being religious and scientists, neither of them have an answer for it. It's something that they have to give themselves over to.
yeah, and it's clear that Cherry Coke's opinion, even if it's not exactly Pynchon's, is that nothing brought them together. They just happened to run into each other, whatever it was that set them in motion.
Mm-hmm.
In thinking about it, when y'all were just talking about that, it made me kind of think about. I was having a conversation with my son the other day about. He was asking about, kind of in a roundabout way, the meaning of life. And we were, so I parted ways with religion a long time ago. And so we're kind of always telling him and my daughter, like, you believe what you want to believe as long as you are a good person and you can back up whatever you believe in with something that allows you to articulate it, then that's cool, whatever. But he was asking about like kind of the meaning of life, and I was thinking about a quote from Dan Barker, who I saw speak a long time ago. He was a former minister and left the faith and has kind of gone on. He's kind of a more polite version of like the Dawkinses and Sam Harris's and Hitchenses. But he mentioned in the speech that he gave that when he was confronted with the whole argument about what the meaning of life is for someone who doesn't believe in any kind of deity, he said there's not really a meaning of life. There's meaning in life, and it's what you get from your experiences. It's what you believe your purpose to be, and it doesn't matter what your faith is or anything like that. It's just what you take from this life defines what that meaning is. And in thinking about y'all's kind of description of that ending section there, kind of put me in mind of that again, that these, you can try and work out the machinations of the universe and how everything works, and honestly we'll probably never know. As advanced as science can ever get, the likelihood of ever understanding fully the workings of the universe and everything is slim to none. And it's almost a futile chase when you could be pursuing it's worthwhile. Science is absolutely worthwhile. I have to put that out there. But that you can't let that keep you from having those experiences that ultimately define the meaning of life.
Yeah, that's very poignant. Absolutely. Can we read the quote before we move into funny parts? I feel like we should.
What machine is it, young Cherry Coke later bade himself good night, that bears us along so relentlessly? We go rattling through another day, another year, as through an empty town without a name. In the midnight, we have but memories of some pause at the pleasure spas of our younger day, the maidens, the cards, the claret. We seek to extend our stay, but now a silent functionary in dark livery indicates it is time to reboard the coach and resume the journey. Long before the destination, moreover, shall this machine come abruptly to a stop. Gathered dense with fear, shall we open the door to confer with the driver, to discover that there is no driver, no horses, only the machine, fading as we stand in a prairie of desperate immensity. That was going to be my quote, but I had decided on a different one prior to that. But that is such a beautiful passage.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, or I was going to ask actually, whether throughout this entire book, the question hangs open, whether how much of what is being told by Cherry Cokes is true, and not necessarily is true, but how much of what he's saying is true to him. How much of this is true to him? Because clearly he's not making up this random put upon single mother, essentially, like that. She comes up later in the story, and she's part of this world. But what is this carriage ride? Is this coach real? Did he actually take a coach ride that didn't have a driver or horses, that stranded them in the middle of the prairie? Or is this just a metaphor with some actual conversation as the kernel of truth?
I think it's possible that he did take a carriage ride at some point, not necessarily that had no driver or, those other details, but at a certain point in the carriage ride, he asked himself, what if there was no, driver? What if this, what if that? And that kind of led his mind down the path that quote kind of takes. That was how I kind of came away with it, because it's clear that at some point he had this epiphany that, religious thinking, or at least Christian religious thinking, didn't have truth in it for him. And I could see this thought, as it's expressed here, being the sort of conversion point, anyway, away from an idea of an ordered reality with a Judaistic worldview or a Judaistic deity at the head of it. So I think it works on both levels. I don't know if there was literally a driverless carriage that he was in at some point, but I think that likely at some point he did ride in a carriage, and his thoughts wandered towards the metaphor that we're kind of picking apart here at the end of the chapter.
Yeah, I wouldn't treat it as anything but a metaphor,
Yeah.
based on the fact that it's all quotes at the end, except for he goes to such lengths to talk about how it's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, even though that has nothing to do with anything else. And then he goes to that's the only time when he would have had the opportunity to survive off of Octorara Peach Brandy, which is the entire premise of telling the story, is being stranded and having to survive off drinking nothing but brandy.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. It reads more as metaphor. Kate pretty much summarized everything I would have said.
All right, thanks.
All right. So, what stood out to y'all as far as the humor in this set of chapters?
So we've talked about a fair amount of the things that I would have mentioned as we've gone through the episode, but there's one exchange in particular that I love, when they are once again on the farm talking to the man and his wife about what they're doing, where it struck me as being the same kind of humor that I've seen in so many like movies or TV, especially in like modern time, where they're sitting there talking to Harlan and his wife, and it says, exactly 15 miles due south of here, Dixon gently. We'll want to set up another post. 'Twill mark the 0 point or beginning of the west line. The point here in your field will tell what its longitude is, as well as the latitude of the south edge of Philadelphia. It ties those two facts together, you see. That wasn't my question. Mr. Tumbling fired his rifle at us, says Dixon. And what made you think I wouldn't? We gambled, suppose Mason and Dixon. And then his wife comes in and says, I'll just fetch down the rifle, says Mrs. Harlan. And just that interaction of why did you come here? And trying to initially bring up like this scientific point, and then really revealing that it's just, the last guy shot at us, is something that I feel like I've seen in Curb Your Enthusiasm in particular a lot of times, like that type of exchange. And so that definitely made me laugh as a funny moment that we haven't already talked about.
Yeah, I like that. I like the comedy of that part a lot too.
Yeah. For mine, we kind of, we touched on most of them. The only other one I wanted to bring up was to kind of bookend the quibbling at the start of chapter 31. At the end of chapter 33, they have another little, I referred to it in my notes as a kind of a stereotypical married couple argument from a TV show or a movie. It's the last paragraph of page 340, Another holiday flare-up of many preceding, which at first had sent Harlans of all ages cringing against the walls or scrambling up the ladder, yet soon subsided to but one more sound of untamed nature to be grown used out here, like thunder or certain animal mimicries at night from across a creek. Each time the surveyors apologize for their behavior, then presently are screaming again. Apologize, scream. Apologize, scream. Daily life in the Harland house grows jagged. After a Christmastide truce with the rest of the winter waiting them, perhaps more of it than any can imagine themselves surviving without at least one serious lapse in behavior, the surveyors decide to travel to Lancaster, perhaps in hopes that the imps of discord will fail to pursue them across the Susquehanna. So just that imagery of them just screeching at each other just amuses me to no end.
I think my favorite comedic part was, I want to say it's in this section, the part where they enter like the coffee house or pub, where like the smoke and the fumes from the coffee and everything are so full, like fill up the air so much that you can't see other people. And specifically the part where it's like they talk about how there's so much coffee being ground that everyone kind of has like, you know, a contact high or like a caffeine high just from entering into the establishment. It did kind of remind me of, I don't know if you all have seen This Is the End.
Yeah.
Kind of dumb, kind of awesome comedy from 10 years ago.
I love like the first 45 minutes of that movie.
Yeah, because it reminded me of the part where McLovin Michael Cera talking. Michael Cera was like a parody of himself, is talking about how like he doesn't do cocaine, and then McLovin like gets a bunch of coke and like blows it into his face, and he's like, "Now you do."
Yeah,
it kind of reminded me of that a little bit. But just generally, that part just I just like that part, and I thought it was just kind of comedic to picture that type of establishment.
Yeah, I really like that section talking about how like the infinitesimal grinds have ended up in the corners of their eyes and stuff.
Oh God, yeah. Ugh.
I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna pick two, but they're very small footnotes to sections we've already talked about. In the opening section where they're bickering, I just really loved the choice for Mason to say inexpensive salvo in response to Dixon saying, "It's clear you don't want anyone to look at you."
Yeah,
because it is a cheap shot, and it's the best way to phrase cheap shot, probably.
That's a good one.
And second, in the scene where RC is trying to vomit up the watch, he tells his kids, enjoy yourselves, children, even at the expense of your poor suffering old father. If you're that disparate for merriment, no matter, go mock too. Soon will equal inconvenience befall you. Eat every one, 'tis life. Will not go swallowing watches, thank ye. Not if you want to sneak up on an Indian someday, you won't. Hadn't planned on it, Pa. That's a great little sitcom scene, essentially.
Yeah. Let's move into quotes. Mine is long, so bear with me because I'm gonna read probably the whole thing or at least most of it. But I think it's just such a good passage. So it starts on page 306, at the very bottom of page 306 on my edition. They saw white brutality enough at the Cape of Good Hope. They can no better understand it now than then. Something is eluding them. Whites in both places have become the very savages of their own worst dreams, far out of measure to any provocation. Mason and Dixon have consulted with all it seems to them they safely may. Recall that there are two kinds of electricity, Dr. Franklin remarked, positive and negative. Cape Town's curse is its weather, the electric charge during the stormy season being everywhere positive, whilst in the dry season all is negative. Are you certain, Dixon mischievously, 'tis not the other way round? That the rainy weather, yes, somewhat brusquely. Whichever direction it goes, the relevant quantity is here, is the size of the swing between the two, that vertiginous repolarizing of the air, and perhaps the aether too, which may be affecting the very mentality of the people there. Then what's America's excuse, Dixon inquired, mild as country tea. Unfortunately, young people, recalls the Reverend, the word liberty, so unreflectively sacred to us today, was taken in those times to encompass even the darkest of men's rights, to injure whomever we might wish, unto extermination were it possible, free of royal advice or proclamation lines and such. This being indeed, and alas, one of the liberties of our late war was fought to secure. Bray, on her way out of the room for a moment, turns in the doorway, shocked. What a horrid thing to say. She does not remain to press the point. At the time of Bushy Run, confides Ives Spark, and I have seen the very document, General Bouquet and General Gage both signed off on expenditures to replace hospital blankets used to convey the smallpox to the Indians, as they perhaps too clearly stipulated. To my knowledge, marvels Ives, this had never been attempted on the part of any modern army till then. Yes, Wicks, Mr. Lespark, beaming at the Reverend. You wish to add something? You may ever speak freely here, killing Indians having long ago ceased to figure as a sensitive topic in this house. Since you put it that way, the Reverend, in willed cheeriness, firstly, everyone knew about the British infection of the Indians, and no one spoke out. The Paxton boys were but implementing the same wicked policy of extermination using rifles instead, although, secondly, unlike our own more virtuous day, no one back then was free from sin. The Quakers, as handsomely as traders of less pacific faiths, profited from the sale of weapons to the Indians, including counterfeit brown besses that blew up in the faces of their purchasers, as often as felled any white settlers. Thirdly, how many more are there likely to be? Inquires his brother-in-law. Apparently I must reconsider my offer. Everyone got along, declares Uncle Wicks. You can go looking for sinners, not in an occupied city. You can't go looking for sinners, not in an occupied city, for everyone at one time or another was here was some kind of rogue. The preacher is the printer's devil, the mantua maker is the milkmaid. Even little Peggy Shipton, God bless her outrageous flirt, even at 4 or 5, skipping in and out, handing each of us flowers whilst her father frowned one by one over our disbursements. I'm going to stop there because it goes on for a while, but that passage really exemplifies what we talked about at the beginning of the episode, just that innate cruelty that exists in people. And I can't really add anything to that. I think his words are just so powerful there.
Yeah, my favorite quote, I'm actually surprised it hasn't come up yet this episode. Somebody on the subreddit did highlight this quote a few weeks ago, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. But it's on 345. And it does kind of play into what I was talking about with Manifest Destiny and the frontier and stuff. I may not read the whole paragraph, but I'll read at least parts of it. Does Britannia, when she sleeps, dream? Is America her dream, in which all that cannot pass in the metropolitan wakefulness is allowed expression? Away in the restless slumber of these provinces, and on westward, whatever 'tis not yet mapped, nor written down, nor ever by the majority of mankind seen, serving as a very rubbish tip for subjunctive hopes for all that may yet be true. Earthly paradise, fountains of youth, realms of Prester John, Christ's kingdom, ever behind the sunset, safe till the next territory to the west be seen and recorded. I think it goes on from there. That paragraph is some of Pynchon's best prose in any of his books, in my opinion. I really love the Prester John reference. Who I was surprised at the time, and I've kind of been surprised by how much it's come up since then. But I was first introduced to Prester John, the concept of Prester John, from the Animal Collective single a few years ago. Which is kind of weird to me again, because I feel like I should have come across it earlier than that, but I don't think I ever did. And that paragraph does kind of also remind me, like I said, of Manifest Destiny and like the kind of the idea of the frontier, and how, you know, whatever there's always something like beyond the sunset, like behind the sunset or something. Like there's always, you know, the fountain of youth or something miraculous waiting for us in the western portion of America. And generally, I don't know, that section kind of makes me think of the Mormon belief that Jesus, like after he died on the cross, like ascended and then visited North America.
Yeah.
Which I've always found the Mormon theology and all of that, all of their beliefs very interesting, and not in a way I want to convert to Mormonism, but just kind of in an anthropological way. Like I can't, like, kind of like, it's just super interesting to me, some of the stuff that they believe.
Yeah.
Some of the aspects of their theology. But yeah, I just love that quote.
It's a good one.
It is a very good one. Mine, my quote is just a piece of description, really. It comes from page 305 when Mason and Dixon are shuttled into this coffee house that's wreathed in smoke, which does lead to another funny point in this chapter, where like once the insane news is delivered that these killings are going to continue, the smoke begins to recede and you can start to see people again. But the description initially of the coffee house is, I think, absolutely beautiful, where he says, "This way, gentlemen." Mr. Chantry helpfully steering the surveyors to the alley and through a back entry into the coffee house, where they find tumult easily outroaring what prevails outside. With its own phylogenious weather, at once public and private, created of smoke billowing from pipes, earths, stove, the room would provide an extraordinary sight, were any able to see, in this combination, peculiar and precise, of unceasing talk and low visibility, that makes riot's indoor sister, conspiracy, not only possible, but resultful as well. One may be inches from a neighbor, yet both blurred past recognizing. Thus may advice grow reckless and prophecy extreme, given the astonishing volume of words moving about in here, not only aloud, but upon paper as well. Paper being waved in the air, poked at repeatedly for emphasis, held up as shielding against uncongenial remarks. Here and there in the nebulosity, lone lamps may be made out at undefined distances, snugly haloed. Servant boys moving to and fro, house cats in warm currents of flesh running invisibly before them, each boy vigorously working his small bellows to clear a path through the smoke, meantime calling out names true and taken. It's such a incredible piece of prose from a descriptive element. I mean, obviously what he is describing is absurd. Like a coffee house so thick with smoke that, you know, you need a bellows to clear a path to find somebody. Like you can't actually see anyone. You know, that concept is inherently absurd, but he uses the absurdity of the situation he's creating to make incredibly poignant statements about like one of them here being the talk in low visibility that makes riot's indoor sister conspiracy not only possible but resultful as well, or advice grow reckless and prophecy extreme given the astonishing volume of words moving about. And the idea, like, he uses it to describe this phenomenon that when you're not visible and when you're in these positions where you can speak freely because nobody's going to tie your words back to you necessarily because they can't see you, that suddenly so many things that are ordinarily eschewed in conversation or wouldn't be put forth in conversation or wouldn't be talked about openly suddenly can be. You know, it's one of these moments where we talk about Pynchon's humor, we talk about Pynchon's absurdity, and rightly so, but he's so aware of his own, for lack of a better term, tropes or stylized writing that he is able to use it cleverly to talk about real things that human beings do and real realities of, you know, conspiracy or prophecy, as he says there, and that those things are bred in anonymity incredibly well. It was one of those things that just completely struck me off my feet when I read it, and, you know, was one of those like slapping myself on the head moments as far as like, why can't I write like that? Why can't more people write like that? Yeah.
Speaking of the beauty of the prose, I did find it interesting that the word phylogeny or phylogenious comes up in that quote.
Yeah.
Which always it always makes me think of Gene Wolfe every time that word comes up, which the Pigeon Wiki does mention this, but I probably would have gotten there anyway. And I want to say that the surname Wolf also comes up maybe in that chapter or in the chapter before or after. And I don't know. I don't think it's impossible that Pynchon has read some Gene Wolfe. I mean,
no, I think it's likely.
Yeah.
And that word literally meaning the color that is darker than black is such a perfect word choice for what he's describing as well.
Yeah. Will, who stole yours this week?
Well, when Britannia sleeps, is America her dream is literally my favorite paragraph in all of Pynchon's writing. So yeah, Luke, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I guess, having to struggle so hard to find a replacement Because really we have read out a lot of the best quotes in this section.
We have.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna go for one that I really like the image it brings to mind. On 338, the great scepter atop the courthouse continues in the dark to radiate its mysterious force. The stock are gone to sleep. The fish and the wine were excellent. Rooms fill with tobacco smoke. Insomnia and headaches abound. Cards emerge from cherrywood recesses. Occupants of the houses along the river stir among the lumps in their mattresses, ready at any alarm to wake. Their dreams are of Spanish visitors, who turn out to be unexpectedly jolly, with courtly ways, rolling eyes, passionate guitars, not a homicidal thought in the boatload of 'em. Everyone ends up at an all-night redato, with piles of mysterious, delectable Mediterranean food. Sandwiches made of entire loaves stuffed with fried sausages and green peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, cheese melted everywhere, fresh melons mysteriously preserved through the voyage, wines whose grapes are descended from those that supplied Bacchus himself, Newcastle dreams drooling into and soaking pillows, helpless before the rapacious festive fleet. How swiftly might the popish scourge descend, another Don Vicente, Havoc's friend, another vile and ringleted signor, another insult to our sovereign shore.
That's a great one.
Yeah, and nothing there, some interesting stuff about Spanish invaders, but really it's just kind of a beautiful dream image.
I had that one highlighted as well. That's just, great imagery. Absolutely love it. So we have one comment that Luke's going to read, and I will apologize in advance. This comes from Apple Podcasts, and it's a review that was left there, and I think it was left back in May. So I apologize to this user if you're listening. I'm sorry for it taking so long to find this. And I'll use this real quick as a moment to mention, if you haven't already heard, if anyone is listening to this on Stitcher, which is where I was listening to a lot of my podcasts, they are discontinuing the app entirely in August. So if that is your platform of choice and you haven't already got the email from them, I would definitely recommend looking into other podcast platforms pretty soon, because you got about 2 months from now.
All right. So the comment is from user Tar Heel Monk. Like Cody said, it's on Apple Podcasts. So the comment is, this podcast is quickly becoming one of my favorites for in-depth analyses of literature. They have great insight and perspective. The audio quality is also very good. Thank you for that. We really appreciate it. We have kind of considered, we will finish with Pynchon's oeuvre in the next few years, and we have kind of floated the idea of perhaps continuing on after that with covering other authors or something. I don't know. We do really appreciate that comment, though.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
And then we also got an email, our weekly email, I guess is fair to say now, from Brett, who has been such a great resource and friend, I think, to the podcast now. So Brett sent us quite a bit on this one, so I'm really excited to share his thoughts on this. So Kate, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, of course. And obviously seconded on Brett's contributions. They've been absolutely excellent. Thank you for listening and for writing these weekly emails. I know all of us really appreciate it. This time through, Brett said, "Took me a couple extra days to listen to the latest episode, but really enjoyed it. The discussion on the Washington episode was great, especially the stuff about appropriation. That's right in line with a whole lot of my annotations on that episode. Just a great, insightful discussion. Thank you very much. I think we all enjoyed that aspect of recording the episode quite a lot. I think we discovered a lot about what was being done there as we talked about it. The only small detail I have to add involves Washington trying to get Gershom to invest in Washington's Dismal Swamp Land Company. Here are 2 glosses from the companion that I think showcase how this really highlights the issues he discussed in this episode. 279.32, Dismal Swamp Land Company. Land wasn't added to the official name until 1814, but Washington was a major shareholder in the Dismal Swamp Company, which sought to buy the Great Dismal Swamp in southern Virginia and northern North Carolina, drain it, and then resell the land at a profit. The scheme didn't work, though the company did turn a profit in 1810 thanks to the lumber industry. 279.36. Wave Gershom back. Are Mason and Dixon shushing because they don't want to provide real estate advice, or because they've been told not to interfere in master-slave relationships? The power dynamics are a labyrinth here. Washington is giving Gershom the appearance of power. It is Gershom's money to invest. But he's also suggesting his slaves' money be invested in his own company and its bad business plan. Is it really advice? A command? Is Washington waving Gershom back because he's afraid Mason and Dixon might give contravening input? Much of what's going on here appears to involve Washington trying to look like a nice guy while still maintaining all of his power and privilege. This ties in quite well with your question about bouquet and the proclamation line. Cody, your note about smallpox and blankets will come up later in the novel, so it's a good thing to point out. Here's the simple gloss on Bouquet. 277.1. Bouquet's proclamation. Henry Bouquet was a British military officer during the French and Indian War. Eric L. Town paints a fuller picture, but Bouquet helped negotiate and maintain the Royal Proclamation of 1763, in which Britain forbade colonial American settlement west of the Alleghenies. This was done to make the American colonies easier to rule, but also to avoid further conflict with French settlers in the Ohio River Valley. The edict was wildly unpopular among the colonists, who felt they just fought a war to win that French territory fair and square. The later discussion about Thomas Cressip, who will show up again, involves the fact that Cressip owned some shares in the Ohio Company, which owned land west of the Proclamation line. Those shares got less valuable when the Proclamation came down. Cressip had actually offered Bouquet a chance to buy into the Ohio Company cheaply, probably in hopes of influencing the decision about westward settlement, but Bouquet refused. Washington argues, probably correctly, that there's nothing especially noble in this. Bouquet just wants to be the gatekeeper of westward settlement and reap the benefits associated with that position of power. All this points to the real estate interests that drive things in America. There's a great interview with historian Woody Holton that covers a lot of the general stuff. I'm linking it here. Pynchon is incredibly skeptical of real estate, especially in Inherent Vice, and the Mason-Dixon line is essentially a giant real estate project. It's about drawing lines as a way to define property and create economic value at the expense of nature and native peoples. He then does link to said interview, which is from the Ezra Klein Show, which is a New York Times podcast in an episode from October 19th of 2021. We'll put the link to that in the show notes. I highly recommend taking a look at that link. It was very insightful. One final note on this. The captain of the ship that carries Mason and Dixon to America is named this round's reading. He's Captain Falconer. The Falcon cannot hear the Falconer is a line from Yeats' apocalyptic poem, The Second Coming. And I think part of the idea is that this Captain Falconer is unleashing a powerful, violent force on the continent, force no one can control.
All right. So again, thank you, Brett. These I look forward to these emails every week, just because it's so interesting to see all the historical context that he can provide. So I could gush on and on about how much Brett's done to help us out here. So we really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. Next week, we're going to talk chapters 36 through 40. So please do join us. We did also finally get around to setting up a Twitter account. We'll have a link to that in the show notes as well. We are at Pynchon Pod. On there, we also have links to our email and our Instagram page. So if you have any questions or comments or anything, please reach out to us and we will be happy to share them. As always, thank you so much for listening. We really, really do appreciate it. And we'll see you all next week.
Bye.
See ya.
So I am, I think I'm like 2/3 of the way through the Magus. I don't know how you pronounce it. The John Fowles book I've been reading.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
So it lives up to the hype, huh?
It really does. It's very, it's surreal in a way that's really grounded. I don't really know how else to describe it. It's not so surreal that it feels otherworldly, but it's surreal enough to feel uncomfortable. I can totally see how it was an inspiration for the game, because it deals a lot with that kind of psychological manipulation of what is genuine and what isn't. And so I'm kind of at the point, at a point in the book where it's really starting to blur those lines pretty heavily.
Sure.
So it's really good. I'll probably finish it in the next day or two here.
I really want to read it. Everything you've said sounds incredibly fascinating. But I'm have been inundated with books that other people have given me to read. I have a book club with a coworker that we're reading Little Women for right now, and one of my friend's wives gave me 2 Discworld books because she's super she's super
Which
into.
ones?
She gave me Guards, which
Great.
she said that would be like the best starting point because I've read no Discworld.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna ask because I haven't gotten into Pratchett at all, and I've been meaning to because y'all are into
Into
him.
the series.
What was the other one that she gave you?
Small Gods.
Start with Small Gods.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Guards is great. But Small Gods, that was the first one I read. And it's I think part of it, what I enjoyed about it really was the satirization of religion, of organized religion. And Pratchett is so good at that. Like it's like, I'm not sure. I don't know if you've read Hitchhiker's Guide, but it's very on par with that kind of writing style and dry humor.
And that's why I've wanted to read his stuff for a really long time, but I just
it's intimidating.
It is very
so
intimidating.
Many books.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, speaking of Zappa, I can't recommend him to anybody because it's impossible to be like, yeah, of the 80 albums that he released during his life, here's the one to begin with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna post this in here. I found a really good flowchart for Discworld that kind of breaks down where to start with certain books, because some of them operate in a sort of series, although they're really all pretty standalone novels. But you can follow a certain path trajectory with certain characters if you're interested in doing it that way. And like the Rincewind novels are really good. I haven't read all of them, but what I have read is really good. And then I've read Pyramids and Small Gods, so the Ancient Civilizations one is really good. Pratchett, I have not read bad Pratchett. So
sure, that's good. Yeah, I had worked with a guy a long time ago who was getting his PhD in English, and after he learned that I was an ex-minister, he wanted me to read Small Gods and talk about it with him. And then it was the same. The same thing with my friend's wife, and that was why she gave me that book along with Guards. So it's been on my list to read for a while, and I'm looking forward to actually getting to it because I love Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Were you gonna say something, Will?
I was just gonna say, I haven't read Small Gods. I'm saving that one for later. I'm about halfway through a chronological reading of Discworld.
Oh, okay.
I do think probably Guards is like the best introduction to Discworld in general. But yeah, as a former minister, Small Gods is the way to go for you. Everything
awesome.
I've heard.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
But Luke, if you were looking for a recommendation on that, I say pick Guards up or any of the Death novels. Just go for it. Don't really recommend starting with The Color of Magic.
That's a tricky one to start with, yeah.
I've heard that it reads like someone who doesn't know what he's writing yet.
It's really, I mean, okay, it is very much mocking sword and sorcery kind of stuff. And it's very hammy.
Gotcha. Yes, that's a good word for it.
There's a lot more dirty humor than the later books.
Yeah, it gets better as it goes, that series.
Yeah.
And on speaking on Zappa, I saw a similar kind of flowchart for Zappa that breaks it down based on, because I've had the same problem. Like I try to recommend Zappa to people, but it's one of those weird things where basically what they were doing was looking at it from like what kind of music does this person already like, and use that as a foothold into where you're going to go next. Like if they're a jazz fan, give them like Hot Rats or Tinseltown Rebellion, or if they're more into rock, some of the earlier stuff, or some of the like Shut Up and Play Your Guitar stuff. So, but Zappa's the same thing. It's intimidating because there's so damn much of it.
Well,
And
he's so singular in his sense of humor and
yeah,
in his writing that even if you do find like a okay, this person does like jazz, so I'm gonna go with Hot Rats, or this person does like this, I'm gonna go with that. They still might bounce off of Zappa's stuff just because of how singular of an artist he is. For me, what it required was my drum instructor is like a Zappa super fan.
Bosio's a good introduction to Zappa on some of that live stuff.
Yeah,
The Black Page especially.
Yeah, and he told me his recommendation is that no matter what music you listen to, Apostrophe is the best place to start with Zappa.
Apostrophe and Overnight Sensation. That's usually my go-to recommendation.
Yeah, so I listened to Apostrophe, and then he did, Overnight Sensation was the second one. And then after that, he recommended, oh God, what was it? One Size Fits All and Roxy and Elsewhere.
Those are all good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, he's absolutely turned me into like a Zappa obsessed person. Like I at this point I now collect like bootlegs online of shows, and
once it clicks, it's. Have you seen any of the DVDs like Baby Snakes or what was the other one I was thinking of? It's where it's set up like a TV channel. I can't think of the name of it. If you can find those, they're so worthwhile. Baby Snakes especially, it's like 3 hours long of concert footage. But he worked with, I can't remember the guy's name, Bruce something. He was a claymation specialist. And so there's a lot of this claymation art that's interspersed with the music. And it's so wild and so cool because they show you not just the actual claymation itself, but how they do it. So there's a lot of behind the scenes of them setting up all these models and stuff and manipulating them. Really fascinating. It's a really cool concert film if you can find it.
That section of the Zappa documentary was super interesting, where they were talking about that claymation artist and how the two of them sort of found each other and how Zappa used his work through his career. That documentary is really, really good.
It tore me up. It was pretty rough by the end there. Mm-hmm. I was having this kind of Zappa-esque music conversation with my son was asking me what kind of music reminded me of Pinchon. And so I mentioned Zappa, but he's really into hip hop right now. So I've been kind of showing him a lot of what I like. But when he mentioned Pinchon, I was the first thing I thought, and I wasn't sure if you guys were familiar with him, was Aesop Rock.
Yeah.
Yep.
Totally like the most Pinchonian hip hop artist I could think of. There may be a few others, but his ability to use words and play with language has always reminded me of Pinchon.
I got a recommendation then.
Ooh,
maybe
please.
not for your son. It's just really dark. Is Billy Woods.
Oh, that's
Billy
a good
Woods.
Yeah.
He is the most Pinchonian rapper that I'm aware of.
There's a YouTube channel I watch called Dead End Hip Hop, and they've mentioned him several times. Specifically, one of the guys on that channel is like a big fan of his. So he's been on my radar.
Big fan.
Mike Seatown, exactly. Yep.
Yeah. I would also say that Cool Keith would be another option. Some of his projects, like Dr. Octagon, or the other like characters that he would come up with are pretty Pinchonian too in some of it. I mean the concept of a evil like alien space gynecologist who's also a serial killer is pretty out there. But that record, Dr. Octagon, is great.
That's a good album. Rakim also came to mind, like a lot of his wordplay and the way he manipulates language was popped into my head too.
Outside of hip hop, actually, I saw somebody mention this on the subreddit months ago, the Thomas Pynchon subreddit months ago, and I found it weird. But somebody mentioned that "Low" by David Bowie is incredibly like Gravity's Rainbow.
That's my favorite Bowie record.
That is my second favorite Bowie record.
I was listening to it on the plane while getting back into Gravity's Rainbow, and I was just like, wow, yeah, this actually fits like a glove.
That's really interesting.
Because now that you've mentioned it, I could see that. Absolutely.
Low came out in 77?
Sounds right.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was influenced by, because that's when he was in Germany for that time. So,
Berlin Trilogy.
Yeah, the especially like Warszawa.
Yeah.
Super similar to some of the more cyberpunk elements of Gravity's Rainbow.
Yeah, fun fact about that song, by the way, that song was the inspiration for the original name that Joy Division went by.
Yep.
They went by the name Warsaw off of that song, and then there was already a band in Manchester called Warsaw, and so they had to change their name, and then that was when they came up with Joy Division. Yeah, I actually got a chance to go to Hansa Studios when I was in Berlin for a while, and I specifically went there because I wanted to like see the microphone that David Bowie recorded Low in, or like go to the studio booth where Iggy Pop recorded like The Idiot, like these seminal albums from the 70s. And the minute that we walked into the actual like studio and the tour guide walked out, he just immediately went, "Is anyone here a fan of Depeche Mode?" And nobody raised their hand. Like I did.
Yeah.
And I was like, Violator's a good record, but like
It's a good album.
I haven't listened to much else. And he went, okay. And I don't know if he was trying to convert everybody, but he spent the entire tour talking about Depeche Mode.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
At no point did he bring up David Bowie. At no point did he talk about Iggy Pop. Like all these other seminal artists who recorded major records in that same studio. It was just Depeche Mode from top to bottom the entire time.
That's funny.
That's one of the wackiest things.
My son is really into Bowie, and so I was having a conversation with my wife about that time in Germany, and I mentioned because we were listening to Station to Station in the car, but that's my favorite of his. And I just made an offhand comment about how he has no recollection of making that album. And my son was like, "Why?" And I immediately regretted saying that. I was like, just
cocaine is a hell of a
he was
drug.
really busy.
Well, cocaine and neo-Nazism.
Yeah.
My boy.
And milk. He
Milk,
was
hot
he was
peppers.
drinking
Milk and
nothing
peppers.
but milk. Yeah. Oh
Yeah.
my God.
One of my favorite stories from that very aptly titled Low period of David Bowie's life is he went to go get Iggy Pop from rehab, and the moment that he picked up Iggy Pop from rehab, he just immediately went, "Do you want some coke?" And then they started snorting coke seriously to the point where they ran out. David Bowie then drove his car looking for his drug dealer's house, and like pulled up onto the lawn of what he assumed was his drug dealer's house, and started like blaring the horn, trying to get his drug dealer's attention. And then like went to the front door when no one answered, and as soon as the door opened, David Bowie realized he was at the wrong house. And I cannot imagine what that must have been like to answer your door and there is a David Bowie from the late 70s coked out of his mind, and his Audi is parked on your front lawn. Like, that would be one of the most surreal experiences.
Oh,
Well, and he's furious because he's a cokehead looking for his fix.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh man. Yeah. So if you're obviously you're a big Bowie fan, and I think we've talked about it before, but if you haven't watched the Venture Brothers, you need to watch the Venture Brothers, because he pops into that show so much, and in a very large way at certain points too.
I have
Those
not
Iggy
watched
Pop.
it. Oh, perfect.
What was that,
They're
Will?
both pretty good. Oh, Iggy Pop pops up too.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Iggy Pop and Klaus Nomi as well. He's in there a couple times.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll definitely have to watch that.
It's such a good show.
What is it
Yeah.
on?
It's on HBO Max.
Okay.
I think it might be on Hulu also. So the show got kind of unceremoniously canceled before they were able to wrap everything up. It had a history of, they really took their time between seasons. Like, that show came out in 2003, and in season 7 aired last year.
Wow.
So they really, really took their time writing it, but it shows. That show is so tightly done. There was never a bad episode. You find things. It's very Pinchonian in that sense. Like, I have rewatched that show endlessly and find new stuff throughout it.
Yeah, it's a show that it feels like if you just started, it feels like it might be another Adult Swim crappy like parody of the golden age of cartoons.
Johnny Quest and all that.
Yeah, but no, it is actually very insightfully written.
Yeah, I've had other people recommend it to me, not in the same terms of like, hey, both Bowie and Iggy Pop, two of your favorite music artists, are in this show.
I don't know how they wouldn't mention that to you.
I don't know how they didn't either,
Yeah.
because there have been definitely times where I have not shut up about Iggy Pop during conversations with these people, but I will definitely have to check that out.